the Ottoman army stopped marching. Lichtschweichig 90,000 soldiers, one of the largest armies ever assembled in that century. They had crossed the Danube under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had conquered Constantinople and brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees. No force in Eastern Europe could stand against them. Everyone knew this, and yet they stopped. What they saw ahead of them, stretching along the road to the Wallachian capital, was something none of them had expected. A forest of wooden stakes, 20,000 of them, maybe more, and on each stake a human body. Men, women, children, soldiers, peasants, all of them impaled, all of them left to rot in the open air. The smell hit the army before the sight did. Clouds of crows circled overhead. The bodies had been there for days. Some were still alive, hanging in silence, too weak to scream. According to Ottoman chroniclers, Sultan Mehmed, a man who had ordered massacres, who had watched cities burn, looked at the scene and turned his horse around. He reportedly said that he could not defeat a man capable of doing this. A man who would turn his own land into a graveyard just to send a message. That man was Vlad III of Wallachia. History would call him Vlad the Impaler. His enemies called him a devil. His own people called him a hero. Centuries later, an Irish novelist would borrow his family name, Dracula, and attach it to a vampire. But the real Vlad was not supernatural. He was not a creature of fantasy. He was human, completely, terribly human. And his story did not begin with stakes and corpses. It began decades earlier, in a world that most people today have forgotten. A world where small countries were crushed between empires, where princes were murdered by their own nobles, where children were sent away as hostages and loyalty meant nothing. Vlad was born into that world. He did not choose it, but he learned its rules. He learned that mercy was weakness, that trust was dangerous, that fear, real, permanent, overwhelming fear, was the only thing that kept a ruler alive. By the time he planted that forest of bodies outside Targoviste, he had already lost his father to assassination. His older brother had been tortured and buried alive. He himself had spent years as a prisoner of the Ottoman Empire, watching, waiting, learning how his enemies thought. What he became was shaped by what he survived. This is not a simple story of a monster. It is not a story of a hero either. It is the story of a man who lived in an impossible time, made impossible choices, and left behind a legacy that still haunts us more than 500 years later. To understand him, we have to go back before the stakes, before the war, before the name Impaler meant anything at all, back to the world that made him and the family he was born into. Europe in the early 15th century was not a peaceful place. It was not stable. It was not safe. The Black Death had swept through just decades earlier, killing somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Entire villages had been wiped out. Cities had emptied. Fields lay untended because there was no one left to work them. The survivors inherited a broken world, one filled with labour shortages, economic chaos, and a deep, lingering trauma that touched every family. But the plague was only part of the story. The continent was also fractured by religious conflict. The Catholic Church, which had held Western Europe together for centuries, was struggling with its own divisions. There had been rival popes, corruption scandals, growing resentment from ordinary people who saw church leaders living in luxury while peasants starved. And then there was the threat from the east. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding for over a century. What had started as a small Turkish state in Anatolia had grown into one of the most powerful forces the world had ever seen. By the 1420s, the Ottomans controlled most of the Balkans. Serbia had fallen. Bulgaria had fallen. Large parts of Greece were under Ottoman rule, and Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome, was surrounded on all sides. Most people in Western Europe did not fully understand what was happening. France and England were busy fighting each other. The Italian city-states were consumed by their own rivalries. Spain was still divided into competing kingdoms. The Ottoman advance was someone else's problem, a distant concern. But for the people who lived in the path of that advance, there was nothing distant about it. Wallachia was one of those places. It sat in a dangerous location. To the south, across the Danube River, lay Ottoman territory. To the north and west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, a Catholic power that saw itself as the defender of Christian Europe. Wallachia was caught between them, a small principality, a buffer zone, a place where empires collided. The land itself was fertile. Rolling plains stretched between the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube. The soil was good for farming. The rivers provided fish and trade routes. In a different time, in a different location, Wallachia might have prospered quietly, but geography made that impossible. Any army marching from Ottoman territory toward Hungary had to pass through Wallachia. Any army marching from Hungary toward the Ottomans had to do the same. The principality was not just a country, it was a corridor, a battlefield, a prize to be fought over by powers far larger than itself. The rulers of Wallachia understood this. They had no illusions about their situation. Survival meant playing both sides. It meant paying tribute to the Ottomans when necessary, accepting Hungarian support when possible, and never fully committing to either. One wrong move, one moment of perceived disloyalty, could bring invasion, destruction, death. This was the world Vlad would be born into. But before we reach him, we need to understand the system that governed Wallachia, because it was not like the kingdoms of Western Europe. It operated by different rules, and those rules would shape everything that followed. In France or England, kingship passed from father to son. The eldest male heir inherited the throne. It was not always peaceful. There were wars of succession, disputed claims, assassinations, but the principle was clear. Blood determined who ruled. Wallachia worked differently. The ruler was called a voivode. The word meant something like war leader or military commander, and the position was not strictly hereditary. In theory, the voivode was chosen by the boyars, the noble families who controlled most of the land, the wealth, and the military power in the principality. This sounds almost democratic. It was not. What it meant in practice was constant instability. The boyars did not choose rulers based on merit or wisdom. They chose rulers based on self-interest. They supported whichever prince would give them the most power, the most land, the most freedom to do as they pleased. And when a ruler stopped serving their interests, they replaced him. Sometimes through politics, often through murder. Between 1418 and 1476, a span of less than 60 years, Wallachia had more than a dozen different rulers. Most of them were deposed, many of them were killed. Some lasted only months. A few lasted only weeks. The throne was not a position of security, it was a target. Two rival branches of the royal family fought for control during this period. One was called the House of Danesht. The other was called the House of Draculesht. They were related by blood, descended from the same ancestors, but they had become bitter enemies. When one branch held the throne, the other plotted to take it. When power changed, planning their return, Vlad's family belonged to the Draculesht. His grandfather, Mircea the Elder, had been one of Wallachia's most successful rulers. Mircea had fought the Ottomans, negotiated with Hungary, and managed to keep his throne for over 20 years. That was an extraordinary achievement in a place where most rulers barely survived a decade. Mircea understood the delicate balance required to survive. He paid tribute to the Ottomans when he had to. He accepted their authority on paper, but he also maintained ties with Hungary and the Christian powers. He built fortifications, he trained soldiers, he was always preparing for the next conflict, even while negotiating peace. His reign was not without violence. He fought battles against the Ottomans, against rival claimants, against rebellious boyars. But he won more often than he lost, and he held on to power longer than almost anyone before or after him. When Mircea died in 1418, everything fell apart. His sons immediately began fighting over the throne. The boyars split into factions, each supporting a different candidate. The Ottomans saw an opportunity to install a ruler who would be more compliant. Hungary saw an opportunity to install a ruler who would be more loyal to Christian Europe. Wallachia became a battleground, not just between foreign powers, but between members of the same family. Brothers killed brothers, cousins betrayed cousins. The throne changed hands again and again. This was the pattern that Vlad II, the future father of Vlad the Impaler, grew up watching. He was one of Mircea's sons, though probably illegitimate. He had a claim to the throne, but so did many others, and in the chaos that followed Mircea's death, he was pushed aside. For years he lived in a kind of exile. He stayed in Transylvania, which was controlled by Hungary, and he waited. He watched the throne pass from one rival to another. He saw how quickly fortunes could change. He learned patience. He also learned how to make himself useful. Vlad II was a capable military commander. He fought in campaigns alongside Hungarian forces. He proved his loyalty to the Christian cause. He cultivated relationships with powerful nobles, with church officials, with anyone who might one day help him claim what he believed was rightfully his. And he understood something crucial about the politics of his time. In a world where small states survived by balancing between empires, the key was to have friends on both sides. You needed the Hungarians to support your claim, but you also needed the Ottomans to tolerate your rule. Lean too far in either direction, and you would be destroyed. This balancing act would define his reign. It would also, eventually, destroy his family. But that was still years away. In the 1420s, Vlad II was simply a prince in waiting, a man with ambition and skill, but without a throne. The Ottoman Empire continued to expand. The Balkans fell further under Turkish control. The pressure on Wallachia grew, and the stage was being set for the next generation of conflict. Somewhere in this chaos, a child would soon be born. A child who would inherit his father's name, his father's enemies, and his father's impossible situation. But first his father had to claim the throne. And to do that, he needed something that would set him apart from all the other claimants, all the other ambitious princes waiting in the wings. He needed a symbol, a mark of legitimacy, something that would tell the world he was different. In 1431 he found it. The Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund of Luxembourg, was looking for allies against the Ottomans. He had created an organization called the Order of the Dragon, a brotherhood of Christian knights sworn to defend the faith against Muslim expansion. Membership was by invitation only. It was an honour reserved for the most trusted, most capable warriors in Christendom. Vlad II received that invitation. He travelled to Nuremberg, where Sigismund held court, and he was inducted into the order. He swore oaths. He received the insignia, a dragon, curled in a circle, with a cross on its back. He became, officially, a Knight of the Dragon, and he took a new name to mark the occasion. Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. In Romanian, the word drac has two meanings. It means dragon, but it also means devil. The dual meaning was probably intentional. Vlad II wanted to be seen as fierce, as dangerous, as someone not to be trifled with. The dragon was a symbol of power. The hint of the devil added something darker. He minted coins showing the dragon. He wore the order's insignia prominently. He made sure everyone knew he was a member. And when his son was born, later that same year, the child inherited the name. Dracula, son of the dragon, son of Dracul. The boy who would become Vlad the Impaler entered the world carrying a name that meant both power and darkness. He did not choose it. He could not have known what it would come to represent. But the name would follow him through history. It would outlive him by centuries. And it would eventually become the most famous name in horror literature, attached to a vampire who bore almost no resemblance to the real man. That was all far in the future. In 1431 there was only a baby, a father with a new title, and a world that was about to become even more dangerous. The throne of Wallachia was still held by others, but Vlad Dracul was ready to make his move. He had the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor. He had the support of Hungarian nobles. He had years of military experience and political cunning. In 1436 he finally seized his chance. The town of Sighisoara sits in the heart of Transylvania, surrounded by green hills and medieval walls. In the 15th century, it was a prosperous Saxon trading town, German-speaking, well-fortified, and relatively safe compared to the chaos of Wallachia to the south. This is where Vlad III was most likely born, in late 1431. His father, Vlad Dracul, was living there at the time. He had not yet claimed the Wallachian throne. He was still a prince in exile, waiting for his opportunity, building his alliances. The house where the family stayed still stands today. It has been rebuilt and renovated many times over the centuries, but a small plaque marks it as the birthplace of the man who would become Vlad the Impaler. Tourists visit now. They take photographs. They buy souvenirs from the gift shop. The horror of what Vlad would become has been softened into something marketable, something safe. But in 1431 there was nothing marketable about the situation. There was only a family living in uncertain circumstances, waiting for a chance to reclaim their power. Vlad III was the second of three sons. His older brother, Mirza, was probably born a few years earlier. His younger brother, Radu, would come a few years later. We know very little about their mother. Some sources suggest she was a Moldavian princess, possibly a relative of the ruling family there. Others suggest she was a secondary wife or concubine. Her name has been lost to history. What we do know is that these three boys, Mirza, Vlad and Radu, would all play significant roles in the bloody politics of Wallachia. And all three would meet violent ends. But that was still years away. In the early 1430s they were simply children, sons of a prince who did not yet have a throne. Their father was focused on one thing, seizing power. Vlad Dracul had spent years preparing for this moment. He had the backing of the Holy Roman Emperor. He had cultivated relationships with Hungarian nobles. He had proven himself as a military commander. Now he needed the right opportunity. That opportunity came in 1436. The details are murky. Medieval chronicles are often incomplete or contradictory, but the basic outline is clear. The ruling voivode of Wallachia, a member of the rival Danish faction, had fallen out of favour with his Hungarian backers. Vlad Dracul saw his chance. With Hungarian support he invaded Wallachia and seized the throne. After years of waiting, he was finally voivode. The family moved south, from Sighisoara to Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital. Young Vlad, now about 5 years old, left the relative safety of Transylvania and entered a world of royal courts, political intrigue, and constant danger. Târgoviște was not a grand city by Western European standards. It was modest, fortified, functional. The princely palace was more of a military headquarters than a luxurious residence. Soldiers were everywhere. The atmosphere was tense. This was not a peaceful court. It was a place where power was held by force and lost by carelessness. Young Vlad would have absorbed this atmosphere. He would have seen the guards, the weapons, the constant vigilance. He would have learned early that danger was always present. His education began in these years. As a prince, he would have been taught to ride horses, to handle weapons, to command men. He would have learned the basics of Orthodox Christianity. Wallachia was an Orthodox country, aligned religiously with Constantinople rather than Rome. He would have studied the history of his family, the politics of his region, the enemies who surrounded him. But more than any formal education, he was learning by observation. He was watching his father navigate an impossible situation. Vlad Dracul had seized the throne with Hungarian support, but holding it required a different kind of skill. Hungary expected loyalty, the Ottomans expected submission, and Wallachia could not survive a war with either. The mathematics were brutal. If Vlad Dracul supported Hungary against the Ottomans, the Turks would invade and destroy him. If he submitted to the Ottomans, Hungary would support a rival claimant and destroy him that way. There was no safe choice. There was only the endless, exhausting work of playing both sides. Tribute had to be paid to the Ottomans, not just money, though money was part of it, but also symbolic submission. The voivode was expected to acknowledge the Sultan's authority, to provide troops when requested, to behave as a loyal vassal. At the same time, Vlad Dracul had to maintain his relationship with Hungary. He had to appear committed to the Christian cause. He had to participate in discussions about crusades, about pushing back against Ottoman expansion, about defending Christendom. These two positions were fundamentally incompatible, but Vlad Dracul tried to hold them both. He paid tribute to the Ottomans while secretly communicating with Hungary. He made promises to both sides that he could not possibly keep. Young Vlad watched all of this. He saw the envoys coming and going. He heard the whispered conversations. He learned that words and reality were different things. That a ruler said whatever was necessary to survive. That loyalty was a performance, not a principle. These lessons would stay with him. The early years of Vlad Dracul's reign were relatively stable. He managed to hold the throne, to keep both empires at bay, to maintain the delicate balance, but the pressure was always there, and it was about to get much worse. In 1440, a new sultan came to power in the Ottoman Empire. His name was Murad II, and he was determined to expand Ottoman control over the Balkans. He looked at Wallachia, this small principality that kept trying to play both sides, and he decided it was time to bring it firmly under control. The method he chose was simple and brutal. He demanded hostages. This was standard Ottoman practice. When the Sultan wanted to ensure a vassal's loyalty, he required them to send family members to the Ottoman court. These hostages would be treated well, educated, housed in comfort, given opportunities, but they were always understood to be leverage. If the vassal rebelled, the hostages would be killed. Murad demanded that Vlad Dracul send 2 of his sons to the Ottoman court. This was the moment that would shape the rest of Vlad III's life. His father faced an impossible choice. Refuse, and the Ottomans would invade. Wallachia would be destroyed. The family would be killed or scattered. Everything Vlad Dracul had worked for would be lost. Or he could agree. He could send his children into the hands of his enemies. He could trade their safety for his throne. He chose the throne. In 1442, Vlad, now about 11 years old, and his younger brother Radu, about 7, were taken from their home and sent east. They were handed over to Ottoman officials and transported to the heart of the empire. The narrator pauses here to let this sink in. These were children. They were being sent to live among people who might kill them at any moment. Their father had made a calculated decision that his political survival was worth more than his son's safety. We do not know what Vlad thought when he learned what was happening. We do not know if he cried, if he raged, if he went silent. The sources do not tell us, but we can imagine. An 11-year-old boy taken from everything he knew, sent to live with enemies, knowing that his life depended on his father's choices. This was the moment that broke something in Vlad. Or perhaps it was the moment that made him. Either way, he was never the same. His mother's reaction is also lost to history. We do not know if she protested, if she begged her husband to find another way, if she wept when her sons were taken. We know almost nothing about her at all. She exists only as a shadow in the historical record, present presumably, but never described. The boys were gone. Vlad Dracul remained on his throne, and the balance he had worked so hard to maintain continued, at least for a while. But the cost was enormous. He had sacrificed his own children to keep his power, and those children would never forget it. Vlad and Radu were taken to Adrianople, one of the Ottoman capitals. They would spend the next several years there, living as hostages, learning the ways of their captors, and growing into very different men. Their father continued to rule Wallachia. He continued to play his dangerous game, balancing between Hungary and the Ottomans. He did not know that his time was running out. The world was about to change. A great crusade was being planned. The Christian powers of Europe were gathering their forces for one final push against the Ottoman Empire. And Vlad Dracul would be caught in the middle, forced to choose sides in a conflict that would determine the fate of Eastern Europe. His choice would cost him everything. But that story belongs to the next part of this history. For now, we follow the boys, Vlad and Radu, as they entered the Ottoman world, as they learned its language, its customs, its cruelties, as they became, in very different ways, products of their captivity. The years they spent as hostages would shape everything that followed. They would determine who Vlad became, what he was capable of, and why he would one day plant 20,000 bodies on stakes outside his own capital. Those years began now, and they began in a place very far from home. The journey east took weeks. Vlad and Radu travelled under Ottoman guard, moving through territories that had recently been conquered by the Turks. Bulgaria, which had been an independent kingdom just decades earlier, was now firmly under Ottoman control. The boys would have seen the evidence everywhere. Turkish soldiers, Ottoman officials, mosques rising where churches had once stood. They were heading to Adrianople, known today as Edirne. It was one of the Ottoman capitals, a major administrative centre, and the place where the Sultan often held court. The city was sophisticated, wealthy, and utterly foreign to two boys raised in the small courts of Wallachia. When they arrived, they entered a world unlike anything they had known. The Ottoman court was one of the most advanced in the world. While Western Europe was still recovering from the Black Death, still fighting petty wars between feudal lords, the Ottomans had built an empire that stretched from Anatolia to the Balkans. They had professional armies, efficient bureaucracies, and a culture that valued learning, art, and architecture. The boys were not thrown into dungeons. They were not chained or beaten, at least not at first. The Ottoman hostage system was more subtle than that. The goal was not simply to hold prisoners, it was to create future allies. Many princes who spent time at the Ottoman court returned to their homelands as loyal vassals. They had been educated in Turkish ways, had formed relationships with Ottoman officials, had come to see the empire as a source of stability rather than a threat. Some converted to Islam, some married into Turkish families, some became more Ottoman than the Ottomans themselves. This was what the Sultan hoped would happen with Vlad and Radu. He wanted to transform them into useful tools, princes who would one day rule Wallachia on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, grateful for their education and dependent on Turkish support. The boys received a thorough education. They learned Turkish, which was essential for anyone hoping to navigate the Ottoman world. They studied the Quran, though conversion was not immediately required. They trained in horsemanship, archery, and military tactics. They observed the workings of one of the most sophisticated governments in the world. In many ways, it was an excellent education, better, probably, than anything they would have received in Wallachia. The Ottomans had access to knowledge from across their vast empire: Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, Arab mathematics. A curious student could learn a great deal, but it was still captivity. The boys were watched constantly. Their movements were restricted. They knew that their lives depended on their father's behaviour, hundreds of miles away. One wrong move by Vlad Dracul, and they could be executed. This knowledge shaped everything. Every meal, every lesson, every conversation took place under the shadow of potential death. The boys could never fully relax, never fully trust anyone, never forget their situation. And they responded to this pressure in very different ways. Radu was the younger of the two, probably about 7 years old when he arrived. He was at an age when children adapt quickly, when new languages come easily, when the world is still flexible and open, and Radu adapted. He learned Turkish fluently. He adopted Ottoman customs. He made friends among the Turkish nobility. He was charming, attractive, and eager to please. The Ottomans liked him. He fit in. As he grew older, Radu became close to the young Prince Mehmed, who would later become Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians. Some sources suggest it was romantic or sexual. Others describe it as a close friendship. Whatever the exact nature, Radu became part of Mehmed's inner circle. He also converted to Islam. This was a significant step. It meant abandoning the Orthodox Christianity of his homeland, breaking with his family's religious tradition. But it also opened doors. A Muslim prince could rise higher in the Ottoman system than a Christian hostage ever could. Radu was becoming Ottoman. He was leaving his Wallachian identity behind. Vlad's experience was entirely different. He was older when he arrived, about 11, and perhaps old enough to remember his life before captivity more clearly. He remembered his father, his home, his expectations of what his life would be, and he resented what had happened to him. The sources describe Vlad as difficult, rebellious, uncooperative. He did not adapt the way his brother did. He did not make friends among the Ottomans. He did not embrace Turkish culture or show any interest in conversion. According to some accounts, he was punished for his attitude, beaten perhaps, isolated. The details are unclear. They come from sources written years later, some of them hostile to Vlad, some of them trying to explain his later cruelty. But the general picture is consistent. Vlad did not submit. This raises a question that historians have debated for centuries. What was happening inside Vlad's mind during these years? We cannot know for certain. We have no diaries, no letters, no direct testimony from Vlad about his time as a hostage. We can only infer from what came later. What seems clear is that these years hardened him. He was surrounded by enemies dependent on people he hated, watching his brother become one of them. He learned to hide his feelings, to observe without revealing himself, to wait. He also learned about the Ottomans, not just their language and customs, but their military tactics, their political strategies, their strengths and weaknesses. He watched how they organized their armies, how they conducted sieges, how they administered conquered territories. He was absorbing information that would later prove valuable. and he was learning about fear. The Ottomans used terror as a tool of statecraft. They impaled prisoners. They massacred populations that resisted. They understood that fear could be more effective than any army. Reputation for brutality made conquest easier. Cities surrendered rather than face destruction. Vlad watched this. He learned from it. He saw how effective terror could be. Some historians have suggested that Vlad's later use of impalement was directly inspired by what he witnessed during his Ottoman captivity. The method was not Wallachian, it was Ottoman. Vlad took his enemy's weapon and turned it against them. This is speculation, of course. We cannot know exactly what Vlad was thinking or when he first conceived of using mass impalement as a political tool, but the connection seems plausible. He spent his formative years in a world where impalement was common, where terror was policy, where violence was a language everyone understood. He learned to speak that language fluently. The years passed. Vlad grew from a boy into a young man. He remained a hostage, still dependent on his father's behaviour, still waiting for something to change. And then in 1444, something did change, but not in the way anyone expected. Far to the west, the Christian powers of Europe had finally organised a major crusade against the Ottomans. The King of Poland and Hungary, a young man named Vlad III, led an army south toward Ottoman territory. The goal was ambitious: to push the Turks out of Europe entirely, to reclaim the Balkans for Christendom. Vlad Dracul faced an impossible choice. The Crusaders expected him to join them. He was a member of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to fight the Ottomans, but his sons were still hostages. If he joined the crusade, they would be killed. He tried to find a middle path. He sent a small contingent of troops to support the crusade, but he did not lead them himself. He hoped this would satisfy the Christians without provoking the Ottomans too severely. It satisfied no one. The crusade ended in disaster. At the Battle of Varna in November 1444, the Ottoman army crushed the Christian forces. King Władysław was killed on the battlefield. The dream of driving the Turks from Europe died with him. The defeat sent shockwaves through Christendom. Hungary was weakened, the Balkans remained under Ottoman control, and Wallachia was more vulnerable than ever. Vlad Dracul's attempt to play both sides had failed. The Ottomans knew he had sent troops against them, even if he had not led them personally. The Hungarians knew he had not fully committed to the crusade. He had enemies on all sides now. The boys remained hostages, but the political situation that had kept them alive was becoming increasingly unstable. 3 more years passed. Vlad Dracul continued to rule Wallachia, but his position was deteriorating. The boyars were restless. The Hungarians were looking for a more reliable ally. The Ottomans were demanding greater submission. In 1447 the end came. A faction of Wallachian boyars, supported by the Hungarian military commander John Hunyadi, moved against Vlad Dracul. The details of what happened are unclear, but the outcome is certain. Vlad Dracul was captured and killed. His eldest son, Mircea, Vlad's older brother, was also captured. His fate was even worse. According to the most reliable accounts, Mircea was tortured by the boyars of Târgoviște and then buried alive. He was probably in his early 20s. The news reached Adrianople. Vlad, now about 16 years old, learned that his father and brother had been murdered. Not by the Ottomans, not by foreign invaders, but by their own people. Wallachian boyars had killed them. Men who had sworn loyalty, who had eaten at their table, who had called themselves subjects. This was the defining moment of Vlad's life. Everything that came after, the brutality, the mass executions, the war against the nobility, can be traced back to this moment. His father had been betrayed and murdered. His brother had been tortured and buried alive. The men responsible were Wallachians. Vlad would never forget, and he would never forgive. The Ottomans saw an opportunity. With Wallachia in chaos, they could install a ruler who would be loyal to them, and they had the perfect candidate. A young prince who had spent years at their court, who spoke their language, who understood their ways. They released Vlad and gave him a small army. His mission was to claim his father's throne. In 1448, at about 17 years old, Vlad returned to Wallachia for the first time in 6 years. He was no longer a child. He was no longer a hostage. He was a prince backed by Ottoman power, ready to take what he believed was rightfully his. But his first reign would be brief, and the lessons of his captivity were only beginning to bear fruit. Vlad crossed into Wallachia in the autumn of 1448. He was 17 years old, backed by a small Ottoman force, and determined to claim his father's throne. The country he returned to was in chaos. His father's murder had triggered another round of the endless succession struggles that plagued Wallachia. The boyars were divided. Different factions supported different claimants. The throne had already changed hands at least once since Vlad Dracula's death. The current ruler was Vladislav II, a member of the rival Donetsk faction. He had taken power with Hungarian support, which meant he was aligned against the Ottomans and against any prince the Ottomans might back. Vlad was exactly that kind of prince. He had Ottoman soldiers behind him. He had Ottoman money funding his campaign. In the eyes of the Hungarians and their allies, he was a Turkish puppet, a traitor to Christendom, a tool of the enemy. This was deeply ironic. Vlad had spent 6 years as an Ottoman hostage. He had been held against his will, separated from his family, forced to watch his brother become a collaborator. He hated the Ottomans. He would spend most of his adult life fighting them. But in 1448 they were his only option. He had no other backers, no other army. If he wanted to avenge his father and claim his throne, he had to accept Ottoman help. Politics makes strange alliances. Vlad accepted. His campaign was brief. He entered Wallachia, gathered what local support he could, and moved against Vladislav II. The details of the fighting are sparse. Medieval chronicles rarely provide the kind of detailed military accounts we might want. But the outcome is clear. Vlad won. He drove Vladislav the Mouse out and took the throne. For the first time in his life, Vlad III was voivode of Wallachia. He was 17 years old. He had survived captivity, survived the murder of his father and brother, survived the journey back to a country that barely remembered him. He had won, but his victory lasted only 2 months. The problem was timing. While Vlad was fighting for Wallachia, a much larger conflict was unfolding nearby. John Hunyadi, the Hungarian military commander who had supported Vladislav II, was engaged in a major campaign against the Ottomans, the same Ottomans who had just helped Vlad take his throne. When Hunyadi's campaign ended, inconclusively as it turned out, he turned his attention back to Wallachia. He was not going to tolerate an Ottoman-backed prince on his southern border. He supported Vladislav II's return. Vlad had no chance. His Ottoman backers were gone, pulled back to deal with other concerns. His local support was thin. He had been away for 6 years, and most Wallachians did not know him. The boyars, as always, were ready to switch sides the moment the wind changed. Vladislav II returned with Hungarian support. Vlad was driven out. His first reign was over almost before it began. He fled north into Moldavia, where his mother's family had connections. He was a prince without a throne again, a refugee, a failure. But he was alive, and he had learned something important. Ottoman support was not enough. The Turks were useful, but they were also unreliable. They had their own interests, their own priorities. They would help a Wallachian prince when it suited them, and abandon him when it did not. If Vlad wanted to hold power, really hold it, not just grab it for a few weeks. He needed different allies. He needed the Hungarians. This was a remarkable pivot. The Hungarians had supported the faction that killed his father. John Hunyadi himself had backed the boyars who murdered Vlad Dracul and buried Mircea alive. By any normal logic, Vlad should have been Hunyadi's enemy for life. But Vlad was not operating on normal logic. He was operating on survival. He spent the next several years rebuilding, first in Moldavia, where he stayed with relatives and observed the political situation, then, surprisingly, in Hungary itself. The details of this period are murky. We do not know exactly when or how Vlad made contact with the Hungarians. We do not know what conversations took place, what promises were made, what deals were struck. But by the early 1450s, Vlad had somehow transformed himself from an Ottoman-backed enemy into a potential Hungarian ally. Part of this was simply circumstance. The political situation was shifting. Vladislav II, the man the Hungarians had supported, was proving to be an unreliable partner. He was making his own deals with the Ottomans, trying to play the same balancing game that Vlad Dracul had played. The Hungarians were growing frustrated. They needed someone else, someone who would be more firmly committed to the anti-Ottoman cause, someone who had personal reasons to hate the Turks. Vlad was perfect. He had spent years as an Ottoman hostage. He had been humiliated, imprisoned, forced to watch his brother convert. He had every reason to want revenge, and he was willing to say whatever the Hungarians wanted to hear. He presented himself as a Christian warrior, a defender of the faith, a prince who would stand firm against Ottoman expansion. He downplayed his earlier Ottoman backing. That had been necessity, not choice. His true loyalty was to Christendom. The Hungarians listened. They were pragmatic people. They did not care about Vlad's past as long as he was useful in the present. John Hunyadi died in 1456, but his son Matthias Corvinus continued the family's policies. The Hungarians continued to look for reliable allies in Wallachia, and Vlad continued to position himself as the best candidate. Meanwhile, he was watching and learning. He observed Hungarian military tactics. He studied how they organized their armies, how they fortified their borders, how they dealt with the Ottoman threat. He made contacts among Hungarian nobles, building relationships that would serve him later. He also nursed his grievances. He had not forgotten what had happened to his father and brother. He had not forgotten the boyars who had betrayed them. He was patient, but he was not forgiving. The years of exile were years of preparation. Vlad was waiting for his moment, and in 1456 that moment finally came. Vladislav II had worn out his welcome. His attempts to balance between Hungary and the Ottomans had satisfied no one. The Hungarians were ready to replace him, and Vlad was ready to be the replacement. With Hungarian support this time, not Ottoman, Vlad launched his second campaign for the Wallachian throne. He crossed into the country with a small army, gathered supporters as he went, and moved against Vladislav II. The two men met in battle near Târgoviște. The fighting was fierce but brief. Vladislav II was defeated. According to some accounts, Vlad killed him personally, hand-to-hand combat, a sword through the body. Whether this is literally true or not, it captures something important. This was personal. Vladislav II represented the faction that had killed Vlad's family. His death was not just a political victory, it was revenge. In August 1456, Vlad III became voivode of Wallachia for the second time. He was 25 years old now. He had spent 8 years in exile, 8 years preparing, 8 years waiting. He was not the same person who had briefly held the throne in 1448. He was harder, more calculating, more dangerous, and he had no intention of being driven out again. His first priority was survival. He knew the pattern of Wallachian politics. He knew that boyars made and unmade princes. He knew that loyalty was temporary and betrayal was constant. If he wanted to hold power, he had to change the rules. The traditional approach was to negotiate with the boyars, to buy their supports with grants of land, with positions at court, with promises of influence. Every previous voivode had done this. It was how the system worked. Vlad chose a different approach. Within months of taking power, he began moving against the nobility. Not all of them, not yet, but enough to send a message. Boyars who had supported Vladislav II were arrested. Some were executed. Their lands were confiscated. This was not unusual in itself. New rulers often punished their predecessors' supporters, but Vlad went further than most. He was not just removing political enemies, he was beginning to dismantle the entire system that had made Wallachia ungovernable. The boyars had too much power. That was the fundamental problem. As long as they could make and unmake princes, no ruler was safe. Vlad intended to break them, but he moved carefully at first. He consolidated his position. He built up his military forces. He secured his borders. He waited for the right moment to strike decisively. That moment came at Easter, probably in 1457, though the exact date is disputed. Vlad invited the noble families of Wallachia to a feast at Targovište. This was traditional. Easter was a time for the prince to gather his court, to display his generosity, to reinforce the bonds of loyalty. The boyars came expecting food, wine, and celebration. What they got was something else entirely. During the feast, Vlad reportedly asked the older boyars a question. How many voivodes had they seen in their lifetimes? The answers varied, but they were all high. Some of these men had served and betrayed 12 different princes. They had survived by switching sides, by backing whoever seemed likely to win, by treating loyalty as a commodity to be bought and sold. Vlad listened to their answers, then he gave his judgment. The older boyars, those he considered most guilty of past betrayals, were arrested on the spot. They were taken outside and impaled. The method that would make Vlad infamous was being deployed for the first time on a large scale. But the younger boyars and their families received a different punishment. They were not killed immediately. Instead, they were marched north toward the Carpathian Mountains. Their destination was the ruins of Poenari Fortress, a crumbling stronghold on a cliff above the Argesh River. There they were put to work. They carried bricks. They hauled stone. They rebuilt the fortress walls with their own hands. Many of them died from exhaustion, from exposure, from the brutal conditions. The survivors completed the work. Poenari became Vlad's mountain stronghold, built literally on the bodies of the nobility. This was not random cruelty, it was calculated political terror. Vlad was sending a message that everyone in Wallachia would understand. The old rules no longer applied. The boyars who had made and unmade princes for generations were no longer in control. There was a new power in the land, and it would not be challenged. The Easter massacre, if we can call it that, broke the back of the traditional nobility. Some boyars fled to Hungary or the Ottoman Empire. Others submitted completely, hoping to survive by demonstrating absolute loyalty. The political class that had destabilized Wallachia for decades was shattered. In its place, Vlad built something new. He promoted men from lower ranks, soldiers, minor nobles, even commoners, to positions of power. These men owed everything to Vlad. They had no independent power base, no family connections that might tempt them to betrayal. Their loyalty was to him alone. He also built up his military forces. He recruited soldiers from the peasant class, trained them, equipped them. He created an army that answered to him directly, not to the boyars. For the first time in generations, the voivode of Wallachia had real, personal military power. The transformation was remarkable. Within a year or two of taking power, Vlad had changed the fundamental structure of Wallachian politics. He had broken the nobility, centralized power, and created a state that functioned according to his will. But the methods he used to achieve this transformation were horrifying, and they were only the beginning. The stakes that had been planted outside Târgoviște were not coming down. They were multiplying. Vlad had found his weapon, the tool that would make him both feared and famous, and he was just getting started. The reign of the Impaler had begun. The Wallachia that Vlad now ruled was a different country than the one his father had governed. The boyar class was broken. The traditional power structures had been swept away. For the first time in living memory, the voivode held something close to absolute power. But power brings its own problems. Vlad had enemies everywhere. The boyars he had destroyed had relatives, friends, allies. Many had fled to neighbouring countries, Hungary, Moldavia, the Ottoman Empire, and they were plotting their return. They spread stories about Vlad's cruelty, seeking support for their cause. The Ottomans were watching closely. They had helped Vlad take the throne once before, and they expected gratitude. They expected tribute. They expected submission. Vlad was giving them none of these things. And the Hungarians, despite their current alliance with Vlad, were always calculating. They supported him because he was useful, not because they trusted him. If he became inconvenient, they would find someone else. Vlad understood all of this. He knew that his position was precarious, that enemies surrounded him, that one mistake could cost him everything. He responded the only way he knew how, with more control, more fear, more violence. The early years of his reign were spent consolidating power. He travelled constantly throughout Wallachia, showing himself to his subjects, demonstrating that he was in command. He built fortifications. He trained soldiers. He established a network of informants who reported on any signs of disloyalty. He also imposed order on the country. This is where the stories about Vlad become complicated, because some of them sound almost positive. According to various accounts, Vlad cracked down on crime with extraordinary severity. Thieves were impaled, murderers were impaled, dishonest merchants were impaled. Anyone who broke the law faced the same punishment, regardless of their status. The famous story of the Golden Cup illustrates this. Vlad allegedly placed a golden cup at a public fountain in Târgoviște. Anyone could use it to drink, but no one was allowed to steal it. According to the legend, the cup remained in place throughout his entire reign. No one dared touch it. Whether this specific story is true or not, it reflects a broader reality. Crime rates apparently dropped dramatically under Vlad's rule. People were afraid to break the law because the punishment was so terrible and so certain. Some Wallachians remembered this positively. For ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, small merchants, the reign of terror had an upside. The roads were safe. Bandits were gone. You could travel without fear of robbery. You could leave your door unlocked. This is the complexity of Vlad's legacy. The same brutality that horrified outside observers created a kind of order that some of his subjects appreciated. He was a monster, but he was their monster. He protected them from criminals, from corrupt officials, from the chaos that had plagued Wallachia for generations. Of course, this protection came at a terrible price. Vlad's justice was arbitrary and extreme. Minor offences could result in death. A woman whose husband's shirt was poorly made might be impaled for laziness. A merchant who gave short measure might be impaled for dishonesty. There was no proportionality, no appeal, no mercy, and the targets were not always criminals. Vlad used impalement against anyone he perceived as a threat, political rivals, suspected traitors, entire communities that he considered disloyal. The line between justice and terror was non-existent. Foreign merchants were particularly vulnerable. Wallachia sat on important trade routes, and merchants from Germany, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire passed through regularly. Vlad viewed them with suspicion. They were outsiders. They had connections to foreign powers. They might be spies. Several incidents involving merchants became notorious. In one case, a group of German traders complained to Vlad that they had been robbed in Wallachia. Vlad investigated, found the stolen goods, and returned them. Then he had the merchants executed for implying that his country was unsafe, or perhaps simply because he could. Stories like this spread quickly. German pamphlets, printed on the new Gutenberg presses, circulated throughout Europe, describing Vlad's atrocities. These were some of the first viral stories in history, sensational accounts of cruelty designed to shock and entertain readers. The pamphlets were propaganda, of course. They were produced by people who had reasons to hate Vlad, German merchants whose colleagues had been killed, or political enemies seeking to damage his reputation. They exaggerated, embellished, and probably invented some stories entirely. But they were not entirely false. Vlad really did impale thousands of people. He really did use terror as a tool of government. The pamphlets may have distorted the details, but they captured something true about his reign. Meanwhile, Vlad was preparing for something bigger than domestic politics. He knew that the real threat came from outside, from the Ottoman Empire, which had never stopped expanding, which had never stopped demanding submission. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had changed everything. The Byzantine Empire was gone. The Ottomans now controlled both sides of the Bosphorus. They were the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, and they were still hungry for more. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had ambitions that extended far beyond what he had already achieved. He wanted to push into Central Europe. He wanted to take Hungary, and the road to Hungary ran through Wallachia. Vlad knew this. He'd spent years at the Ottoman court. He understood how the empire worked, how it thought, what it wanted. He knew that eventually the Ottomans would come for him. The question was what to do about it. The safe choice, the choice his father had made, was to submit, pay the tribute, send the required troops, acknowledge Ottoman authority. This might buy time. It might preserve Wallachia as a semi-independent vassal state. It was the pragmatic option. Vlad rejected it completely. He had spent 6 years as an Ottoman hostage. He had watched his brother become an Ottoman collaborator. He had been humiliated, imprisoned, treated as a pawn. He was not going to submit to the people who had done that to him. More than that, he believed submission was futile. The Ottomans did not want loyal vassals. They wanted conquest. They would take Wallachia eventually, no matter how much tribute was paid. The only question was whether Wallachians would fight or surrender. Vlad chose to fight. He began preparing for war almost immediately after taking power. He strengthened his army. He built alliances with Hungary and other Christian states. He fortified key positions along the Danube, the river that marked the border with Ottoman territory, and he began provoking the Ottomans. Small insults at first, delayed tribute payments, harsh treatment of Ottoman merchants, shelter for refugees fleeing Turkish rule. The provocations escalated over time. By the late 1450s, Vlad was openly defying the Sultan. He refused to pay tribute. He refused to appear at the Ottoman court when summoned. He made clear that he did not consider himself a vassal. The most famous provocation involved Ottoman envoys. A delegation arrived in Wallachia, probably in 1459 or 1460, to demand tribute and negotiate terms. According to the most widely told version of the story, the envoys refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious custom. Vlad's response was characteristically extreme. He had the turbans nailed to their heads. This story may be legendary. It appears in sources written years after the event, and it has the feel of propaganda, a dramatic anecdote designed to illustrate Vlad's defiance and cruelty. But whether literally true or not, it captures his attitude perfectly. He was not interested in negotiation. He was not interested in compromise. He was sending a message to the Sultan. I am not afraid of you. I will not submit. If you want Wallachia, you will have to take it by force. The message was received. Mehmed II began planning his response. But Vlad was not waiting passively. In the winter of 1461 to 1462, he launched a preemptive strike. He led his army south, across the Danube, deep into Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria. The campaign was devastating. Vlad's forces attacked Turkish settlements, killed thousands of soldiers and civilians, burned villages, and destroyed everything in their path. It was not a conventional military campaign. It was a raid, fast, brutal, and designed to cause maximum damage. Vlad reportedly sent a letter to the Hungarian king boasting of his achievements. The numbers he claimed were staggering, over 23,000 killed according to some versions. Whether accurate or not, the campaign was a direct challenge to Ottoman power. No vassal state had ever done anything like this. Small principalities did not attack the Ottoman Empire. They submitted or they were destroyed. Vlad was breaking all the rules. The Sultan's response was inevitable. Mehmed II assembled one of the largest armies in Ottoman history. Estimates vary, but most sources describe a force of at least 90,000 soldiers. Some say as many as 150,000. This was not a punitive expedition. It was an invasion force designed to conquer Wallachia completely and make an example of its defiant prince. In the spring of 1462, the Ottoman army crossed the Danube. Vlad was waiting for them. He had prepared for this moment for years. He knew he could not defeat the Ottomans in a conventional battle. No one could, not with those numbers. But he had other plans. The war that followed would make Vlad's reputation forever. It would produce the most famous images of his reign: the night attack, the forest of the impaled, the Sultan turning back in horror. It would transform him from a regional warlord into a legend, but it would also cost him everything: his throne, his freedom, nearly his life. The confrontation between Vlad the Impaler and Mehmed the Conqueror was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. Before we follow Vlad into his war with the Ottomans, we need to understand something about the man he had become. The methods he would use against Mehmed were not invented for that campaign. They were the same methods he had been using for years, perfected through constant practice. Impalement was Vlad's signature. It was how he dealt with enemies, criminals, traitors, and anyone else who displeased him. It was his tool of government, his instrument of terror, his message to the world. The method itself was ancient. Impalement had been used by the Assyrians thousands of years before Vlad was born. The Persians used it, the Romans used it, the Byzantines used it, and the Ottomans used it regularly. Vlad had seen it during his years as a hostage. But Vlad elevated impalement to something unprecedented. He used it on a scale that shocked even his contemporaries, and he refined the technique to maximize suffering. The basic method was straightforward but horrible. A wooden stake, sharpened to a point but not too sharp, was driven into the victim's body. The entry point was usually from below, through the buttocks or the abdomen. The stake was pushed upward through the body cavity, carefully avoiding vital organs, until it emerged from the upper chest, the shoulder, or sometimes the mouth. The victim was then raised upright, with the stake planted in the ground. Gravity did the rest. The body's own weight slowly drove it further down the stake. Death could take hours or even days, depending on how carefully the impalement had been performed. Vlad reportedly preferred the slow method. He wanted his victims to suffer. He wanted witnesses to see that suffering. The point was not just execution, it was spectacle. The stakes were often arranged in patterns, concentric circles, geometric designs, forests of bodies stretching for miles. The arrangement was deliberate. It was meant to be seen, to be remembered, to send a message that could not be ignored. Vlad impaled people for many reasons, political enemies obviously. Boyars who had opposed him or whose loyalty he doubted, supporters of rival claimants, anyone connected to the faction that had killed his father. But he also impaled ordinary criminals. Thieves, murderers, rapists, all faced the same punishment. There was no graduated system of justice, no distinction between minor and major offences. Steal a loaf of bread, and you might find yourself on a stake. He impaled people for moral offences. Women accused of adultery, men accused of laziness, anyone whose behaviour he considered improper. The standards were arbitrary, and the enforcement was merciless. He impaled foreigners, German merchants who complained about trade conditions, Ottoman envoys who showed insufficient respect, travellers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He impaled entire communities, villages suspected of disloyalty, towns that had supported his enemies, populations that he wanted to terrorize into submission. The numbers are impossible to verify precisely. Contemporary sources give wildly different estimates. Some claim Vlad killed 40,000 people during his reign. Others say 100,000 or more. The true figure is probably somewhere in between, but even conservative estimates place him among the most prolific killers in European history. What drove this? Why did Vlad embrace such extreme violence? Some historians have suggested mental illness. Perhaps Vlad was a sadist who enjoyed causing pain. Perhaps he was a psychopath, incapable of empathy, unable to see his victims as human beings. This is possible, but it does not fully explain his behaviour. Vlad's violence was not random. It was targeted, calculated, purposeful. He killed specific categories of people for specific reasons. That suggests something more than simple madness. A better explanation might be political. Vlad faced genuine threats from every direction. The Boyars had killed his father. The Ottomans wanted to conquer his country. Rival claimants were constantly plotting against him. In this environment, terror was a rational strategy. If everyone was afraid of you, they were less likely to rebel. If the punishment for disloyalty was horrible and certain, people would think twice before betraying you. If your enemies knew what awaited them, they might decide not to become your enemies in the first place. Vlad had learned this lesson during his Ottoman captivity. He had seen how the Turks used terror to control conquered populations. He had observed that fear was often more effective than love or loyalty. He applied those lessons to his own rule. There is also the matter of revenge. Vlad had suffered enormously. His father murdered, his brother tortured and buried alive. Years of captivity and humiliation. He had reasons to hate, and he had power to act on that hatred. The Boyars who died at the Easter massacre were not random victims. They were members of the class that had destroyed his family. Their deaths were not just political, they were personal. Perhaps all of these factors combined, political calculation, psychological damage, and personal vengeance, all feeding into each other, all pushing Vlad toward ever greater extremes. Whatever the explanation, the results were undeniable. Wallachia under Vlad was a place of order and terror. Crime was virtually non-existent. The roads were safe, the government functioned efficiently, and people lived in constant fear. Foreign observers were horrified. The German pamphlets that circulated through Europe described Vlad as a monster, a devil in human form. They included woodcut illustrations showing mass impalements, bodies arranged in neat rows. Vlad dining calmly among the dying. These pamphlets were propaganda, but they reflected a genuine reaction. Even by the brutal standards of the 15th century, Vlad stood out. Other rulers were violent, violence was normal, but Vlad was something else. He had taken violence to a level that shocked people who thought they had seen everything. The Ottomans had their own name for him. They called him Kazaklı Voyvoda, the Impaler Prince. The name stuck. It would follow him through history, defining him forever. But Vlad did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a just ruler, imposing necessary order on a chaotic land. He saw himself as a Christian prince defending his faith against Muslim invaders. He saw himself as a victim who had become strong, a survivor who would never be victimized again. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Vlad's story. He believed he was right. He believed his methods were justified. He believed that the suffering he caused was necessary and good. Most tyrants believe this. Most people who commit atrocities believe they are serving some higher purpose. Vlad was not unique in this regard, but his certainty, combined with his methods, produced something uniquely horrible. The question of whether Vlad was evil is complicated. By modern standards, obviously yes. Mass murder is evil. Torture is evil. The deliberate infliction of suffering on innocent people is evil. But Vlad did not live by modern standards. He lived in a world where violence was normal, where rulers were expected to be harsh, where mercy was often seen as weakness. By the standards of his own time, he was extreme, but not entirely outside the range of acceptable behaviour. Other 15th century rulers committed atrocities. Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan, who would soon invade Wallachia, had ordered the massacre of entire cities. The Spanish Inquisition, which began during Vlad's lifetime, would torture and kill thousands. The Wars of the Roses in England produced horrors that rivaled anything in Wallachia. This does not excuse Vlad, but it does contextualize him. He was a product of his time, an extreme product, but a product nonetheless. And he was about to face the greatest test of his reign. The Ottoman army was coming. Everything Vlad had built, everything he had done, would be put to the ultimate trial. The war that followed would determine whether Vlad's methods could defeat the most powerful empire in the world. It would produce the most famous images of his reign, and it would ultimately destroy him. But before we reach that war, we need to understand one more thing about Vlad. His violence was not just domestic. He had been provoking the Ottomans for years, deliberately courting the confrontation that was now approaching. He wanted this war. He had prepared for it. He believed he could win. He was about to find out if he was right. The relationship between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire had always been complicated. Technically, Wallachia was a vassal state. It owed tribute to the Sultan. It was expected to provide troops for Ottoman campaigns. Its foreign policy was supposed to align with Ottoman interests. In practice, the relationship was more fluid. Wallachian princes had been playing games with the Ottomans for decades, paying tribute when they had to, defying when they could, always looking for ways to preserve some degree of independence. Vlad's father had played this game. He had paid tribute, sent hostages, made shows of submission. It had not saved him. He had been murdered anyway, caught between Ottoman demands and Hungarian pressure. Vlad drew a different lesson from his father's fate. Submission did not guarantee safety. The Ottomans would take what they wanted eventually, regardless of how much tribute was paid. The only real choice was whether to resist or to surrender. Vlad chose resistance. From the beginning of his reign, he began preparing for war. He strengthened his army, recruiting soldiers from the peasant class and training them in guerrilla tactics. He built fortifications along the Danube. He stockpiled weapons and supplies. He also built alliances. Hungary was the obvious partner. The Hungarians had their own reasons to oppose Ottoman expansion, and they had supported Vlad's claim to the throne. Vlad cultivated this relationship carefully, presenting himself as a reliable Christian ally. He reached out to other Christian powers as well. Venice, which had commercial interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Pope, who was always calling for crusades against the Turks. Anyone who might provide money, weapons, or diplomatic support. At the same time, he began provoking the Ottomans. The provocation started small. Tribute payments were delayed. Ottoman merchants were harassed. Refugees fleeing Turkish rule were given shelter in Wallachia. The Ottomans noticed, but they did not respond immediately. They had other concerns, campaigns in other parts of their vast empire, internal political issues, the endless work of administration. Wallachia was a minor irritant, not a priority. Vlad escalated. He stopped paying tribute entirely. He refused to appear at the Ottoman court when summoned. He made clear that he did not consider himself bound by the vassal relationship. The incident with the Ottoman envoys, the turbans nailed to their heads, was the most dramatic provocation. Whether the story is literally true or not, it represents Vlad's attitude. He was not interested in diplomacy. He was not interested in finding a peaceful solution. He wanted confrontation. Why? What did Vlad hope to achieve? Part of it was certainly personal. He hated the Ottomans. They had held him captive for 6 years. They had turned his brother into a collaborator. Every interaction with them reminded him of his humiliation. But there was also a strategic calculation. Vlad believed that the Ottoman Empire, for all its power, was vulnerable. It was overextended, fighting on multiple fronts. Its subject populations were restive. A successful resistance in Wallachia might inspire others to rebel. More importantly, Vlad believed he could make Wallachia too costly to conquer. He could not defeat the Ottoman army in open battle. No one could. But he could make the invasion so painful, so expensive, so demoralizing that the Ottomans would decide it was not worth the effort. This was the strategy he had been developing for years. Guerrilla warfare, scorched earth, psychological terror. He would not fight the Ottomans on their terms. He would fight them on his own. In the winter of 1461-1462, Vlad launched his preemptive strike. He led his army south, across the frozen Danube, into Ottoman-controlled Bulgaria. The campaign was not a conventional military operation. It was a raid, fast, brutal, and designed to cause maximum damage. Vlad's forces attacked Turkish settlements along the Danube, killing soldiers and civilians alike. They burned villages, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock. They left nothing behind that might be useful to an invading army. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Vlad reportedly sent a letter to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, listing his achievements. The letter claimed over 23,000 killed, men, women and children. The numbers may have been exaggerated, but the campaign was undeniably devastating. Vlad was sending a message. He was showing the Ottomans what kind of war they would face if they invaded Wallachia. He was demonstrating that he was willing to do anything, kill anyone, destroy everything to resist them. The message was received. Sultan Mehmed II was furious. No vassal state had ever dared to attack Ottoman territory like this. The raid was not just a military challenge, It was an insult to his authority, a challenge to his prestige. It could not go unanswered. Mehmed began assembling his response. This would not be a punitive expedition or a limited campaign to bring a rebellious vassal back into line. This would be a full-scale invasion. Mehmed intended to conquer Wallachia completely, remove Vlad from power permanently, and install a ruler who would never dare to defy the Ottoman Empire again. He already had the perfect replacement in mind. Vlad's younger brother Radu, the one who had adapted to Ottoman life, who had converted to Islam, who had become part of Mehmed's inner circle, was ready to take the Wallachian throne. Radu would be a loyal puppet, grateful to the Ottomans for his position, dependent on Turkish support to maintain it. The army Mehmed assembled was enormous. Contemporary sources give different numbers, but most agree it was one of the largest Ottoman forces ever sent against a European target. Estimates range from 60,000 to 150,000 soldiers. Even the lower estimates represent an overwhelming force, far larger than anything Vlad could hope to match. The army included the elite janissaries, the Sultan's personal infantry, considered the best soldiers in the world. It included Sipahi cavalry, heavily armed horsemen who had conquered much of the Balkans. It included artillery, cannons that had breached the walls of Constantinople and could reduce any Wallachian fortress to rubble. And it included Mehmed himself. The Sultan did not delegate important campaigns. He led them personally. His presence signalled that this was not a minor operation. This was a matter of imperial prestige. In the spring of 1462, the Ottoman army began moving north toward the Danube. Vlad knew they were coming. His spies had been tracking Ottoman preparations for months. He knew the size of the force he faced. He knew he was outnumbered by at least 3-1, probably more. A conventional response would have been to negotiate, to seek terms, to submit before the invasion began, and hope for mercy. Many rulers in Vlad's position would have done exactly that. The odds were impossible. Resistance seemed suicidal. Vlad did not negotiate. He did not submit. He prepared to fight. But he would not fight the way the Ottomans expected. He would not meet them in open battle, where their superior numbers and firepower would guarantee victory. He would fight a different kind of war. His strategy had 3 elements. First, scorched earth. As the Ottoman army advanced, they would find nothing. No food, no fodder for their horses, no shelter. Vlad ordered the destruction of everything in the invasion path. Crops were burned, wells were poisoned, villages were evacuated and then demolished. The Ottomans would advance through a wasteland. Second, guerrilla warfare. Vlad's forces would not engage the main Ottoman army directly. Instead, they would strike at the edges. They would ambush supply convoys. They would attack isolated units. They would harass the Ottomans constantly, never giving them rest, never letting them feel safe. Death would come from the shadows, at night, when least expected. Third, psychological terror. This was where Vlad's methods would reach their fullest expression. He would not just kill Ottomans, he would horrify them. He would show them things that would break their morale, that would make them question whether any victory was worth what they were experiencing. The campaign began. The Ottoman army crossed the Danube in late May or early June of 1462. They advanced into Wallachia, expecting resistance. What they found was emptiness. The villages were abandoned. The fields were burned. The wells were fouled with dead animals or poison. There was nothing to eat, nothing to drink, nothing to use. The army had brought supplies, of course, but not enough for a prolonged campaign through a wasteland. They had expected to live off the land, as armies usually did. The land had nothing to offer. The heat was brutal. June in Wallachia is hot, and the army was marching through open country with no shade, No water, no relief. Men began to suffer. Horses began to die. Disease began to spread through the camps, and then the attacks began. Vlad's forces struck at night. Small groups of cavalry would appear out of the darkness, kill as many Ottomans as they could, and disappear before the main army could respond. Sentries were murdered. Supply wagons were burned. Officers were assassinated in their tents. The attacks were not militarily decisive. They did not significantly reduce Ottoman numbers, but they were psychologically devastating. The soldiers could not sleep. They could not relax. They never knew when the next attack would come. The constant fear wore them down more than any battle could have. Vlad was everywhere and nowhere. The Ottomans could not find him, could not pin him down, could not bring him to battle. He was a ghost, striking from the shadows, leaving bodies behind, vanishing into the night. The army pressed on. Mehmed was determined. He had not come this far to turn back. He would find Vlad, defeat him, and end this once and for all. They approached Târgoviște, the Wallachian capital. This was the obvious target. Take the capital, and the war would be over. Vlad would have nowhere left to go. But Târgoviște was empty. The population had fled. The buildings were abandoned. There was nothing there worth taking. And then the army saw what Vlad had left for them. The sight that greeted the Ottomans outside Târgoviște has become the most famous image of Vlad's reign. It was a forest of stakes, thousands of them, stretching for nearly a mile along the road to the city. On each stake was a body. The victims were Ottoman prisoners, soldiers captured during Vlad's raids, during the guerrilla attacks, during the long march through Wallachia. There were also Wallachian collaborators, people Vlad considered traitors, and there were others, men, women, children, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The estimates vary. Some sources say 20,000 bodies, others say more. The exact number hardly matters. What matters is the scale, the horror, the overwhelming visual impact of thousands of corpses arranged in neat rows, rotting in the summer heat. The smell reached the army before the sight did. The stench of decomposition carried on the wind, announcing what lay ahead. Then the crows, thousands of them circling overhead, feeding on the dead. Then the stakes themselves, emerging from the haze like a forest from a nightmare. The Ottoman soldiers stopped. They stared. Some of them vomited, some of them wept. These were hardened warriors, men who had seen battle, who had killed and watched others die. But they had never seen anything like this. According to Ottoman chroniclers, Sultan Mehmed himself was shaken. He rode forward to observe the scene, and then he turned his horse around. He reportedly said that he could not conquer a man who was capable of such things, a man who would do this to his own country, to his own people, just to send a message. This story may be embellished. Mehmed was not a man who frightened easily. He had conquered Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom. He had ordered massacres of his own. He understood terror as a political tool, but even Mehmed had limits. Even he could be shocked. The forest of the impaled crossed a line that even the conqueror of Constantinople was not prepared to cross. The Ottoman army did not turn back immediately. Mehmed was too proud for that, and too determined, but the campaign had lost its momentum. The soldiers were demoralized. The supplies were running low. Disease was spreading, and the enemy they had come to destroy was still out there, invisible, untouchable, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Mehmed made a decision. He would not continue the campaign personally. He would leave a portion of his army behind, under the command of Vlad's brother Radu, to continue the fight. He himself would return to Constantinople with the main force. This was not quite a retreat. Mehmed could claim that he had achieved his objectives. He had invaded Wallachia, had reached the capital, had installed a rival claimant. But it was not the decisive victory he had planned. Vlad was still alive. Vlad was still fighting. The war was not over. Radu took command of the remaining Ottoman forces. He also began a different kind of campaign, a political one. He reached out to Wallachian boyars, promising them restoration of their old privileges if they supported him. He presented himself as a moderate alternative to Vlad's terror. He offered peace, stability, normality. Many boyars listened. They had suffered under Vlad. They had lost family members, lost property, lost power. Radu offered them a way out. All they had to do was betray their prince. The defections began. One by one, then in groups, Wallachian nobles switched sides. They brought their soldiers with them, their resources, their local knowledge. Vlad's support base began to crumble. The war that had seemed like a victory was turning into a defeat. Vlad had driven back the Sultan himself, had created one of the most famous images of terror in history, but he was losing his country anyway, not to Ottoman armies, but to his own people. The betrayal that had destroyed his father was happening again. The boyars were abandoning him, just as they had abandoned Vlad Dracul. History was repeating itself. Vlad fought on. He refused to surrender, refused to negotiate, refused to accept what was happening. He retreated into the mountains, to his fortress at Poenari, the stronghold he had built with the labour of condemned boyars. He would make his last stand there, if he had to. But even Poenari could not hold forever. The fortress was strong, but it was isolated. Supplies were limited. Reinforcements were not coming. The Hungarians who had promised support were nowhere to be seen. According to legend, Vlad's wife, whose name history has not preserved, threw herself from the walls of Poenari rather than be captured by the Ottomans. The river below the fortress is still called the Ladies' River in her memory. Whether the story is true or not, it captures the desperation of those final days. Vlad escaped. Somehow he made it out of Poenari, out of Wallachia, across the mountains into Transylvania. He was heading for Hungary, hoping to find the allies who had promised to help him. What he found instead was a prison. The events of June 1462 deserve closer examination. The night attack on the Ottoman camp and the forest of impaled bodies are the two most famous episodes of Vlad's reign. They have been told and retold for centuries, becoming legend. But what actually happened? The night attack came first. It took place on June 17th, 1462, near the town of Târgoviște. The Ottoman army had been advancing through Wallachia for weeks, suffering from Vlad's scorched earth tactics and guerrilla raids. They were tired, hungry, and demoralized, but they were still an overwhelming force. Vlad decided to strike directly at the heart of that force. He would attack the Ottoman camp at night, with the goal of killing or capturing Sultan Mehmed himself. This was an extraordinarily bold plan. The Ottoman camp was enormous, tens of thousands of soldiers, organised in concentric rings around the Sultan's tent. Security was tight. Approaching undetected seemed impossible, but Vlad had advantages. He knew the terrain intimately. His soldiers were experienced in night operations, and the Ottomans, despite their numbers, were spread thin across a large area. The attack began after midnight. Vlad led his cavalry personally, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men, depending on the source. They approached the Ottoman camp in silence, using the darkness and the terrain to mask their movements. The first the Ottomans knew of the attack was when Wallachian cavalry came screaming out of the night, cutting down everyone in their path. The camp dissolved into chaos. In the darkness, no one could tell friend from enemy. Ottoman soldiers fought each other, mistaking their own comrades for attackers. Fires broke out. Horses panicked and stampeded. The carefully organized military machine became a mob of terrified individuals. Vlad's forces drove deep into the camp. According to some accounts, they came within sight of Mehmed's tent. The Sultan himself had to flee, escaping in the confusion, while his guards fought off the attackers. But Vlad did not achieve his ultimate goal. Mehmed survived. The Ottoman army, though badly shaken, was not destroyed. As dawn approached, the Wallachians withdrew, melting back into the darkness before the Ottomans could organize a counterattack. The night attack was a tactical success, but a strategic failure. Vlad had killed thousands of Ottomans. Estimates range from 15,000 to 30,000, though these numbers are probably exaggerated. He had humiliated the Sultan, had shown that even the mightiest army in the world was vulnerable, but he had not ended the war. The Ottomans regrouped, they continued their advance, and that is when they encountered the forest of the Impaled. The timing and location of the forest are not entirely certain. Some sources place it outside Targovishte. Others suggest it was encountered earlier in the campaign. The details vary from account to account. What is consistent is the description. A vast field of stakes stretching as far as the eye could see. Bodies in various states of decay. The smell of death overwhelming everything. A scene of horror that defied comprehension. Who are the victims? The sources identify several categories. Ottoman prisoners of war made up a significant portion. These were soldiers captured during Vlad's winter raid, during the guerrilla campaign, during the night attack itself. They had been impaled and left as a message to their comrades. Turkish civilians were also among the dead. Merchants, travellers, settlers who'd been living in Bulgarian territories south of the Danube. Vlad's winter raid had swept them up, and they had met the same fate as the soldiers. Wallachian traitors, or people Vlad considered traitors, were represented as well. Boyars who had shown insufficient loyalty, officials suspected of collaboration, anyone whose commitment Vlad doubted, and there were others whose presence is harder to explain. Women, children, people who seemed to have had no political significance, no connection to the war. Perhaps they were family members of traitors. Perhaps they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps Vlad no longer distinguished between guilty and innocent. The arrangement of the bodies was deliberate. They were organised in rows, in patterns, in formations that suggested planning and purpose. This was not random violence. It was theatre. It was designed to be seen, to be remembered, to communicate something that words could not express. What was Vlad trying to say? On one level, the message was simple. This is what happens to those who oppose me. The forest was a warning, a threat, a promise of what awaited anyone who challenged Vlad's authority. But there was something more. The scale of the horror went beyond any practical purpose. 20,000 bodies, if that number is accurate, was far more than necessary to make a point. This was not just intimidation. This was something else. Perhaps Vlad was trying to break the Ottoman army psychologically. He knew he could not defeat them militarily. But if he could destroy their morale, if he could make them so horrified that they refused to continue, he might win anyway. Perhaps he was expressing something about himself. The rage he had carried since childhood. The hatred for the Ottomans who had held him captive. The contempt for a world that had shown him no mercy. The forest was a mirror of his inner landscape, made visible for all to see. Or perhaps after years of violence, Vlad had simply lost any sense of proportion. The killing had become routine. The horror had become normal. He no longer saw the bodies as human beings. They were just materials, tools, props in a performance he was staging for an audience of enemies. We cannot know what Vlad was thinking. We can only see what he did. The Ottoman reaction was profound. Even soldiers who had witnessed terrible things were shaken. The chroniclers who recorded the event struggled to find words adequate to describe it. They fell back on religious language. This was the work of a devil, a demon, something beyond human evil. Mehmed's decision to withdraw, or at least to delegate the remainder of the campaign to Radu, came shortly after. The connection seems clear. The forest of the impaled broke something in the Ottoman army. They had come to conquer a small principality. They had found something they were not prepared to face. But Vlad's victory, if it can be called that, was hollow. He had driven back the Sultan. He had created an image that would echo through centuries. But he had not won the war. Radu remained in Wallachia with Ottoman support. The Boyars were defecting. Vlad's power base was collapsing. The terror that had kept his subjects in line was no longer enough when they had an alternative, a prince who promised peace, who promised normalcy, who promised an end to the horror. Within months, Vlad would be a fugitive. Within a year, he would be a prisoner. The reign of the Impaler was ending, not with a final battle, but with a slow collapse. The forest of the impaled would become his most lasting legacy. It would be depicted in woodcuts, described in pamphlets, retold in stories across Europe. It would make his name synonymous with cruelty, with terror, with the darkest possibilities of human nature. But for Vlad, in the summer of 1462, it was not enough. Nothing was enough. He had done everything he could imagine doing, had gone further than anyone thought possible, and he was still losing. The world he had created through terror was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Vlad fled Wallachia in the autumn of 1462. His army had melted away. His boyars had defected to Radu. His fortresses were falling one by one. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to fight with. He headed north, across the Carpathian Mountains, into Transylvania. His destination was Hungary. King Matthias Corvinus had promised support for the war against the Ottomans. He had taken money from the Pope specifically to aid Vlad's campaign. Now Vlad was coming to collect on those promises. What he found instead was betrayal. The exact circumstances of Vlad's arrest are murky. The sources disagree on details, and some of them were written years after the events they describe. But the basic outline is clear. Vlad arrived in Transylvania expecting to be welcomed as an ally. Instead, he was arrested by Hungarian authorities and taken to the fortress of Visegrad, near the Hungarian capital of Buda. He would remain a prisoner for the next 12 years. Why did Matthias Corvinus turn on him? Several explanations have been offered. The most common involves forged letters. According to this account, Vlad's enemies produced documents that appeared to show him negotiating with the Ottomans, offering to switch sides in exchange for being restored to his throne. The letters were fake, but they gave Matthias a pretext for arrest. This explanation is plausible. Vlad had enemies everywhere, boyars who had fled Wallachia, Ottoman agents, rivals for the throne. Any of them might have produced forged documents to discredit him. But there may have been simpler reasons. Matthias had taken money from the Pope to support a crusade against the Ottomans. He had not actually used that money for its intended purpose. If Vlad arrived at his court demanding the support he had been promised, awkward questions might be asked. It was easier to imprison Vlad and claim he was a traitor than to explain where the crusade funds had gone. There was also the matter of Vlad's reputation. The stories of his atrocities had spread across Europe. The German pamphlets were circulating widely, describing him as a monster. Matthias may have decided that such a man was too dangerous to have as an ally, too unpredictable to trust. Whatever the reason, Vlad found himself a prisoner. After years of wielding absolute power, of deciding life and death for thousands, he was now powerless, confined, dependent on the mercy of a king who had betrayed him. The years that followed are the most obscure period of Vlad's life. We know almost nothing about what happened to him during his imprisonment. The sources fall silent. The man who had dominated the historical record for a decade virtually disappears. He was held at Visegrad at first, then apparently moved to other locations. The conditions of his imprisonment seem to have varied. At times he was closely confined. At other times he was allowed more freedom, living under a kind of house arrest rather than in a dungeon. Some accounts suggest that he eventually converted to Catholicism. Wallachia was Orthodox Christian, and Vlad had been raised in that faith. But Hungary was Catholic, and conversion may have been a condition for improved treatment or for eventual release. He may also have married during this period. Some sources mention a Hungarian wife, possibly a relative of Matthias Corvinus himself. If true, this would suggest that Vlad's status gradually improved over the years, that he moved from prisoner to something more like a guest. But we cannot be certain of any of this. The documentation is thin. The sources are contradictory. Vlad's lost years remain largely lost. What we can say is that the world continued without him. In Wallachia, Radu ruled as an Ottoman vassal. He was everything Vlad had refused to be: compliant, cooperative, willing to submit. The tribute was paid. The troops were provided. The relationship with Constantinople was smooth. But Radu's reign was not entirely peaceful. He faced challenges from other claimants, from boyars who had their own ambitions, from the same instability that had plagued Wallachia for generations. He held on, but his grip was never entirely secure. In 1475, Radu died. The cause is uncertain. Some sources suggest syphilis, others mention different illnesses. He was probably in his early 40s. He had outlived his usefulness to the Ottomans, and his death created a new succession crisis. Wallachia needed a new ruler, and suddenly after 12 years, Vlad became relevant again. The political situation had shifted during his imprisonment. The Ottomans were still powerful, but they were facing challenges on multiple fronts. Hungary was more assertive. Other Christian powers were showing renewed interest in resisting Ottoman expansion. Matthias Corvinus began to reconsider his prisoner. Vlad was a proven military commander. He had experience fighting the Ottomans. He had demonstrated, whatever else might be said about him, that he was willing to resist Turkish pressure when others submitted. Perhaps he could be useful after all. The negotiations that led to Vlad's release are not well documented. We do not know what promises were made, what conditions were imposed, what Vlad had to agree to in exchange for his freedom. But sometime in 1474 or 1475, after roughly 12 years of captivity, Vlad was released. He was not immediately restored to the Wallachian throne. That would take more time, more preparation, more political manoeuvring. But he was free. He was back in the game. The man who emerged from imprisonment was different from the one who had entered. He was older now, in his mid-40s, ancient by medieval standards. He had spent more than a decade watching from the sidelines, unable to act, unable to influence events. The experience must have changed him. But how much had he changed? Had the years of captivity softened him? Had he learned patience, moderation, the value of compromise? Or was he the same man he had always been, just waiting for the opportunity to resume his old methods? The sources give us hints, but no clear answers. There are stories that Vlad, even in captivity, could not entirely suppress his violent nature. One account describes him catching mice and birds in his cell and impaling them on tiny sticks. Whether this is true or merely legend, it suggests that his contemporaries believed the impaler's instincts ran too deep to be changed by mere imprisonments. What is certain is that Vlad wanted his throne back. He had never accepted his removal from power. He had never stopped believing that Wallachia was rightfully his, and now, finally, he had a chance to reclaim it. In late 1476, with Hungarian and Moldavian support, Vlad launched his campaign. He crossed into Wallachia with a small army, gathering supporters as he went. The current ruler, another Ottoman-backed voivode, was weak and unpopular. Resistance crumbled quickly. In November 1476, Vlad III became voivode of Wallachia for the third time. He was back. After 14 years of exile and imprisonment, after losing everything, after being written off by history, he had returned. The Impaler was on his throne again, but his third reign would be even shorter than his first. The enemies who had brought him down before were still out there. The Ottomans had not forgotten him. The Boyars had not forgiven him. And this time there would be no escape. Vlad had perhaps 2 months, maybe less. The sources are unclear on the exact timeline. What is clear is that his return was brief, violent, and final. The end was coming, and it would come quickly. Vlad's third reign began in triumph. He had returned from the dead, politically speaking. He had overcome imprisonment, betrayal, and more than a decade of powerlessness. He was voivode again, master of Wallachia, restored to the position he had fought so hard to win. But the triumph was fragile. Everyone knew it. Vlad knew it. His supporters knew it. His enemies certainly knew it. The circumstances of his return were different from before. He had not seized power through his own strength alone. He had been installed by foreign powers, Hungary and Moldavia, who had their own reasons for wanting him on the Wallachian throne. He was useful to them, a tool in their ongoing struggle against the Ottomans. This meant his position depended on continued foreign support. If that support wavered, if his backers decided he was more trouble than he was worth, he would be vulnerable. He had learned this lesson once already, when Matthias Corvinus had imprisoned him instead of helping him. He could not afford to learn it again. He also faced the same internal problems that had plagued his earlier reign. The Boyars hated him. They remembered the Easter massacre, the mass executions, the destruction of their class. Many of them had supported Radu, had prospered under Ottoman-backed rule, had no desire to return to the terror of Vlad's government. Some boyars had fled when they heard of Vlad's return. Others stayed, watching and waiting, calculating their options. Loyalty was not something Vlad could expect from them. At best he could hope for temporary compliance based on fear, and the Ottomans were not going to accept his return quietly. They had spent years trying to control Wallachia, had installed multiple puppet rulers, had invested blood and treasure in keeping the principality within their sphere of influence. Vlad's restoration was a direct challenge to everything they had worked for. The Sultan Mehmed II was still on the throne, began preparing a response. Another army would be sent. Another campaign would be launched. Vlad would be removed, one way or another. Vlad knew all of this. He had no illusions about his situation. He was surrounded by enemies dependent on unreliable allies, ruling a country that had largely turned against him. The odds were worse than they had been in 1462, and that campaign had ended in disaster. But he was not going to give up. He had not survived 14 years of imprisonment just to surrender now. He would fight as he had always fought. He would use the methods that had worked before: terror, brutality, the systematic destruction of anyone who opposed him. The killings began almost immediately. Boyars suspected of disloyalty were executed. Officials who had served the previous regime were purged. The apparatus of terror that Vlad had built during his earlier reign was being reconstructed, but there was no time. The machinery of repression takes time to build, time to establish, time to make effective. Vlad had weeks, not years. He could not recreate the comprehensive system of control he had maintained before. He could only strike at the most obvious targets and hope that fear would do the rest. It was not enough. The end came in late December 1476 or early January 1477. The exact date is uncertain, as is much else about Vlad's death. The sources disagree on details, and some of them were written years after the events they describe. What seems clear is that Vlad was killed in battle. He was fighting against Ottoman forces, or possibly against Wallachian rebels supported by the Ottomans. The location was somewhere near Bucharest, though the precise site has never been definitively identified. The circumstances of his death are murky. Some accounts say he was killed by Ottoman soldiers in the heat of battle. Others suggest he was assassinated by his own men, boyars who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike, or soldiers who had been bribed to turn against him. The assassination theory has some support. Vlad was reportedly accompanied by a small guard of Moldavian soldiers when he died. If his own Wallachian troops had turned on him, the Moldavians might have been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. It would explain how a seasoned warrior like Vlad could be killed so quickly, so decisively, but we cannot know for certain. The truth died with Vlad, and the accounts that survive are contradictory and incomplete. What happened after his death is somewhat clearer. His body was decapitated. The head was sent to Constantinople, to Sultan Mehmed, as proof that the impaler was finally dead. According to Ottoman sources, the head was displayed on a stake. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who had impaled so many others. Mehmed reportedly wanted to see the head with his own eyes. He wanted to be certain that his old enemy was truly gone. The man who had humiliated him in 1462, who had created the forest of the impaled, who had haunted Ottoman nightmares for 15 years, that man had to be definitively, visibly dead. The display of Vlad's head was a message, just as Vlad's own impalements had been messages. It said, "This is what happens to those who defy the Ottoman Empire. This is how your story ends if you resist us." Look upon the face of the impaler and understand that even the most fearsome enemies can be destroyed. Vlad's body, what remained of it, was supposedly buried at the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake north of Bucharest. This was a traditional burial site for Wallachian rulers, and it would have been appropriate for Vlad to be interred there. But even in death, Vlad remained elusive. When archaeologists excavated the supposed grave site in the early 20th century, they found nothing, or rather, they found a grave, but it contained only animal bones, no human remains, no evidence that Vlad had ever been buried there. Other excavations at Snagov have produced different results. Some have found human remains that might be Vlad's. Others have found nothing at all. The mystery has never been definitively solved. Perhaps Vlad was buried somewhere else entirely. Perhaps his body was lost or destroyed. Perhaps the monks of Snagov moved his remains at some point, to protect them from desecration or for reasons of their own. Or perhaps there is something fitting about the uncertainty. Vlad was a man who inspired legends, who became larger than life even while he was still living. A man like that does not simply die and get buried like anyone else. He becomes a mystery, a question mark, a story that never quite ends. The impaler was dead, but Dracula was just beginning. Vlad's death did not end his story. In some ways it was just the beginning. Within years of his death, accounts of his life were circulating across Europe. German pamphlets, printed on the new Gutenberg presses, told lurid tales of his atrocities. Russian manuscripts described his reign in vivid detail. Turkish chronicles recorded his wars against the Ottoman Empire. These early accounts were not objective histories. They were propaganda, entertainment, moral lessons, everything except neutral reporting. Each source had its own agenda, its own perspective, its own reasons for telling the story in a particular way. The German pamphlets were the most influential in shaping Vlad's Western reputation. They appeared within a few years of his death and were reprinted many times over the following decades. They were among the first bestsellers in the history of printing. The pamphlets described Vlad as a monster. They catalogued his atrocities in graphic detail, the impalements, the mass executions, the cruelty toward merchants and civilians. They included woodcut illustrations showing forests of stakes, bodies arranged in neat rows, Vlad dining calmly among the dying. The tone was one of horrified fascination. The pamphlets condemned Vlad's actions, but they also revelled in describing them. They were the 15th century equivalent of true crime stories, shocking, titillating, designed to thrill readers with tales of evil. Why were the German pamphlets so hostile? Several reasons. German merchants had suffered under Vlad's rule. He had executed traders who displeased him, had confiscated goods, had made commerce in Wallachia dangerous and unprofitable. The merchant communities of Transylvania and other German-speaking regions had every reason to hate him. There were also political factors. The Holy Roman Empire and Hungary were rivals for influence in the region. Portraying Vlad as a monster reflected badly on Hungary, which had supported him. The pamphlets served political purposes as well as commercial ones. Russian sources told a different story. In the Slavic tradition, Vlad was often portrayed as a harsh but just ruler. Yes, he was cruel, but his cruelty was directed at the wicked, at criminals, at traitors, at the corrupt and the dishonest. He punished those who deserved punishment. He maintained order in a chaotic land. This version of Vlad was almost admirable. He was a strong ruler who did what was necessary. His methods were extreme, but his goals were righteous. The suffering he caused was the price of justice. The contrast between German and Russian accounts is striking. The same man, the same actions, interpreted in completely opposite ways. To the Germans, Vlad was a devil. To the Russians, he was something closer to a saint. This divergence tells us something important about how historical figures become legends. The facts matter less than the interpretation. The same events can be made to mean almost anything, depending on who is telling the story and why. Turkish sources offered yet another perspective. To the Ottomans, Vlad was neither a monster nor a hero. He was an enemy. A dangerous one, certainly. A capable one. But ultimately a defeated one. The Ottoman chronicles recorded his military campaigns with professional respect. They acknowledged his tactical skill, his willingness to fight against overwhelming odds, his ability to cause damage far beyond what his small principality should have been capable of. They called him Kazaklı Voivoda, the Impaler Prince, and the name carried a certain grudging recognition. But they also emphasized his defeat. The forest of the impaled was horrifying, yes, but Mehmed had not truly retreated. He had left Radu in charge and returned to other business. Vlad had been driven from his throne, imprisoned for over a decade, and finally killed. The Ottoman version of the story ended with victory, not horror. 3 different cultures, 3 different interpretations. The same man, the same events, transformed into completely different stories. This pattern would continue for centuries. Each generation found something new in Vlad's story, something that spoke to their own concerns and fears. He was endlessly adaptable, a blank screen onto which people could project whatever they needed to see. In Romania, his reputation evolved in interesting ways. During the centuries of Ottoman domination, Vlad was remembered as a symbol of resistance. He had stood up to the Turks when others submitted. He had fought for independence, for Christianity, for his people. Yes, his methods were harsh, but harsh times required harsh measures. This interpretation gained strength during the 19th century as Romanian nationalism grew. The country was struggling to free itself from foreign control. Ottoman, Russian, Austro-Hungarian. National heroes were needed, figures who embodied the spirit of resistance. Vlad fit the role perfectly. Historians and writers rehabilitated his image. They emphasized his military achievements and his defiance of the Ottomans. They downplayed or justified his brutality. He became a patriotic figure, a defender of the nation, a prince who had sacrificed everything for his people. This process accelerated in the 20th century, particularly under communist rule. Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania's dictator from 1965 to 1989, actively promoted Vlad as a national hero. Films were made celebrating his resistance to foreign powers. Books were written praising his strong leadership. Monuments were erected in his honour. The irony was obvious to outside observers. Ceausescu himself was a brutal authoritarian who used terror to maintain control. He found in Vlad a kindred spirit, a ruler who understood that fear was the foundation of power. By celebrating Vlad, Ceausescu was implicitly justifying his own methods. But for many Romanians, the connection to Ceausescu did not diminish Vlad's appeal. He remained a symbol of national pride, of resistance to foreign domination, of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. The complexity of his legacy, hero and monster, defender and tyrant, was part of what made him compelling. Meanwhile, in Western Europe and America, a very different version of Vlad was taking shape. This version had little to do with Romanian nationalism or Ottoman wars. It had everything to do with vampires. The connection began with Bram Stoker. Stoker was an Irish writer and theatre manager who in the 1890s was working on a novel about a Transylvanian vampire. He needed a name for his villain, something exotic, something memorable, something with a hint of darkness. He found it in a book he was researching. William Wilkinson's Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, published in 1820, mentioned a voivode Dracula who had fought against the Turks. A footnote explained that Dracula meant devil in the Wallachian language. Stoker seized on the name. It was perfect, foreign, sinister, evocative. He knew almost nothing about the historical Vlad. He did not know about the impalements, the forest of stakes, the war against Mehmed. He just liked the name. The novel he produced, published in 1897, bore little resemblance to the historical reality. Stoker's Dracula was a Transylvanian count, not a Wallachian prince. He was a supernatural creature who drank blood and could transform into a bat. He was an aristocratic predator, elegant and seductive, preying on innocent victims. The only real connection to the historical Vlad was the name and a vague reference to fighting the Turks. Everything else was Stoker's invention, drawn from vampire folklore, Gothic literature, and Victorian anxieties about sex, death, and foreignness. But the name stuck, and over time the fictional Dracula and the historical Vlad became confused in the public imagination. The process accelerated with the 1931 film adaptation starring Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's Dracula, with his cape, his accent, his hypnotic stare, became the definitive image of the vampire. Millions of people who had never read Stoker's novel knew Dracula from the movies, and gradually people began to assume that the fictional vampire was based on a real person. They heard that there was a historical Dracula, a Romanian prince who had been exceptionally cruel. They connected the dots. The vampire must have been inspired by the Impaler. The blood drinking must have been a metaphor for the bloodshedding. This connection is largely false. Stoker knew almost nothing about Vlad when he wrote his novel. The similarities between the fictional vampire and the historical prince are mostly coincidental, but the connection has proven impossible to break. Today, when most people hear the name Dracula, they think of vampires. They think of Bela Lugosi, of Christopher Lee, of Gary Oldman. They think of castles and coffins and stakes through the heart. They do not think of a 15th century warlord who fought the Ottoman Empire. The historical Vlad has been buried beneath the myth. His real story, complex, brutal, fascinating, has been replaced by a fantasy. The man who impaled 20,000 people has become a cartoon villain, a Halloween costume, a breakfast cereal mascot. There is something sad about this. Vlad's actual life was far more interesting than any vampire story. The trauma of his childhood, the impossible politics of his situation, the desperate war against overwhelming odds. These are the elements of genuine tragedy. The fictional Dracula is entertaining. The real Vlad is haunting. But perhaps the transformation was inevitable. Vlad's story was always about fear. He used fear as a weapon, as a tool of government, as a message to his enemies. He wanted to be terrifying. He succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. The vampire legend is just another form of that terror. It takes the fear Vlad inspired and transforms it into something supernatural, something eternal. The Impaler killed thousands and then died. Dracula kills forever. He cannot be stopped. He cannot be destroyed. He rises again and again in every new adaptation, every new interpretation. In a strange way, the vampire myth has given Vlad what he always wanted, immortality through fear. He is still terrifying people 5 centuries after his death. He has become the monster he always aspired to be. The real man is almost forgotten, but the legend lives on. In Romania today, Vlad III occupies a complicated place in national memory. He's not simply a historical figure. He is a symbol, a controversy, a mirror that reflects the country's own struggles with identity and history. Walk through Bucharest and you will find streets named after him. Visit Transylvania and you will see his image on tourist brochures, restaurant menus, souvenir shops. His face appears on everything from wine bottles to refrigerator magnets. He has become a brand, a marketing tool, a way to attract foreign visitors curious about the real Dracula. But this commercial exploitation coexists with genuine reverence. Many Romanians consider Vlad a national hero. They see him as a defender of their land against foreign invasion, a strong leader who did what was necessary in impossible circumstances. They are proud of him, even as they acknowledge the darkness of his methods. This pride has deep roots. For centuries, Romania was dominated by foreign powers. The Ottomans controlled Wallachia and Moldavia for hundreds of years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire ruled Transylvania. Russia exerted influence from the east. Independence was a dream that seemed perpetually out of reach. In this context, figures who resisted foreign domination became precious. They represented hope, defiance, the possibility that Romanians could control their own destiny. Vlad was one of these figures. His war against the Ottomans, however brief and ultimately unsuccessful, became a symbol of national resistance. The 19th century saw a deliberate effort to rehabilitate Vlad's image. Romanian intellectuals, inspired by the nationalist movements sweeping Europe, looked to history for heroes who could inspire the struggle for independence. They found Vlad. Writers like Mihai Eminescu, Romania's national poet, referenced Vlad in their work. Historians re-examined his reign, emphasizing his military achievements and his resistance to Ottoman pressure. The brutal aspects of his rule were not denied, but they were contextualized, explained, sometimes even celebrated as evidence of his strength. This rehabilitation continued into the 20th century. After World War I, when Romania finally achieved full independence and territorial unity, the need for national heroes became even more acute. Vlad was promoted as a symbol of the Romanian spirit, fierce, independent, unwilling to submit. The communist period brought new dimensions to Vlad's legacy. Nicolae Ceausescu, who ruled Romania from 1965 to 1989, had a particular interest in historical figures who could be used to legitimize his own rule. Vlad was perfect for this purpose. Ceausescu promoted a version of Romanian history that emphasized national independence and resistance to foreign powers. Vlad fit this narrative perfectly. He had defied the Ottomans. He had refused to submit. He had been willing to use any means necessary to protect his country. Films were produced celebrating Vlad's life. The most famous, released in 1979, portrayed him as a tragic hero, a man forced by circumstances to use terrible methods, but ultimately fighting for a noble cause. The film was enormously popular in Romania and helped cement Vlad's status as a national icon. Ceausescu's promotion of Vlad was not subtle. The dictator saw himself as a modern Vlad, a strong leader who would defend Romania against foreign interference, who would use whatever methods were necessary to maintain order and independence. By celebrating Vlad, Ceausescu was implicitly celebrating himself. This connection has complicated Vlad's legacy in the post-communist era. After Ceausescu's overthrow and execution in 1989, Romanians began to reassess many aspects of their recent history. The heroes promoted by the communist regime came under new scrutiny. Some Romanians rejected Vlad along with Ceausescu. They saw the celebration of the Impaler as part of the authoritarian propaganda that had justified decades of oppression. They argued that Romania needed new heroes, figures who represented democracy and human rights rather than terror and absolute power. Others maintained their admiration for Vlad while rejecting the comparison to Ceausescu. They argued that Vlad's context was completely different. He had faced genuine external threats, had fought against a powerful empire, had done what was necessary to survive. Ceausescu, by contrast, had oppressed his own people for personal power. The two men were not comparable. This debate continues today. Romanian historians, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens hold widely varying views on Vlad. Some see him as a hero, some see him as a monster, many see him as both, a complex figure who cannot be reduced to simple categories. The tourist industry has added another layer of complexity. Vlad has become Romania's most famous historical figure internationally, largely because of the Dracula connection. Tourists come from around the world, hoping to see Dracula's castle, to visit the places associated with the vampire legend. This creates awkward situations. Bran Castle, the site most commonly marketed as Dracula's castle, has only a tenuous connection to the historical Vlad. He may have visited it briefly, or he may never have been there at all. The castle's association with Dracula is almost entirely a product of tourism marketing. Romanian authorities and businesses have had to decide how to handle this situation. Some have embraced the vampire connection enthusiastically, creating Dracula-themed attractions, hotels and experiences. They argue that tourism brings money and jobs, and that the vampire legend is harmless entertainment. Others find the commercialization distasteful. They argue that it trivializes Romanian history, reduces a complex historical figure to a cartoon character, and perpetuates foreign misconceptions about their country. They would prefer that tourists learn about the real Vlad, not the fictional vampire. The tension between these perspectives plays out across Romania. In some places, the vampire kitsch is everywhere. In others, there is a deliberate effort to present a more serious, historically grounded account of Vlad's life and times. What do ordinary Romanians think? Surveys and interviews reveal a range of opinions. Many express pride in Vlad's resistance to the Ottomans. They see him as a defender of their ancestors, a man who fought against impossible odds to protect his people. They acknowledge his cruelty, but argue that it must be understood in context. The 15th century was a brutal time. Vlad was no worse than many other rulers of his era. Others are more critical. They point out that Vlad's victims were not only foreign enemies, but also his own subjects. The boyars he massacred were Romanians. The peasants who suffered under his rule were Romanians. His terror was not directed only outward, it was also directed inward, against his own people. Some take a more philosophical view. They argue that Vlad represents something universal about power and human nature. He shows what people are capable of when they have absolute authority and face existential threats. His story is a warning, not a celebration. The younger generation often has a more detached perspective. For them, Vlad is a historical figure, interesting but distant. They did not grow up with the communist-era propaganda that elevated him to heroic status. They are more likely to see him as a complex, ambiguous figure, neither purely hero nor purely villain. What is clear is that Vlad remains relevant. 5 centuries after his death, Romanians are still arguing about him. He still provokes strong reactions, still raises difficult questions about history, morality, and national identity. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his significance. Forgotten figures do not generate controversy. Only those who matter, who touched something deep in the human experience, continue to provoke debate across the centuries. Vlad matters. Whatever else can be said about him, that much is certain. What made Vlad who he was? How do we explain a man capable of such extraordinary violence? These questions have fascinated historians, psychologists, and ordinary people for centuries. The temptation is to reach for simple answers. Vlad was evil. Vlad was insane. Vlad was a monster. These labels feel satisfying. They create distance between us and him. They reassure us that we could never do what he did. But simple answers are rarely true answers. Vlad was a human being, shaped by specific experiences, operating in a specific context. If we want to understand him, really understand him, not just condemn him, we need to look deeper. Start with his childhood. Vlad was born into a world of violence and instability. His father was a prince without a throne, constantly scheming to seize power. His family was surrounded by enemies, rival claimants, hostile boyars, foreign empires. From his earliest years, Vlad would have absorbed the lesson that the world was dangerous and that survival required constant vigilance. Then came the hostage years. At approximately 11 years old, Vlad was taken from his family and sent to live among enemies. He spent 6 years in Ottoman captivity, knowing that his life depended on his father's behaviour. One wrong move, and he could be executed. This experience would have been traumatic for any child. The constant fear, the powerlessness, the knowledge that the people around you might kill you at any moment. the separation from everything familiar and safe. Modern psychology recognizes that childhood trauma can have lasting effects on personality and behavior. Children who experience prolonged fear and helplessness often develop difficulties with trust, with emotional regulation, with empathy. They may become hypervigilant, always scanning for threats. They may learn to suppress their emotions, to hide their true feelings behind a mask of control. Vlad showed many of these characteristics. He trusted no one. He maintained rigid control over himself and his environment. He seemed incapable of mercy or compassion. These traits are consistent with someone who experienced severe childhood trauma. But trauma alone does not explain everything. Many people experience terrible childhoods without becoming mass murderers. Something else was at work in Vlad. Part of it may have been what he learned during his captivity. The Ottomans used terror as a tool of statecraft. They impaled prisoners, massacred populations, employed systematic brutality to maintain control over their vast empire. Vlad watched this. He absorbed it. He learned that fear was power. He also learned about his enemies. He studied Ottoman military tactics, political strategies, cultural practices. He understood how they thought, what they valued, what they feared. This knowledge would serve him well in his later wars, but it also shaped his worldview. He came to see violence not as an aberration, but as a normal part of how the world worked. When Vlad finally escaped captivity and returned to Wallachia, he found that his father and brother had been murdered, betrayed by their own nobles, killed by people who had sworn loyalty to them. This was the final lesson. Trust no one. Loyalty means nothing. The only way to survive is to make everyone so afraid of you that they would never dare to betray you. Vlad's subsequent behaviour makes a terrible kind of sense in this context. The mass executions of boyars, the systematic use of impalement, the creation of a state based on terror. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were the logical application of everything Vlad had learned about power and survival. He was not killing for pleasure. He was killing for control. Every impalement was a message. This is what happens to those who oppose me. Every forest of stakes was a warning. Do not even think about betrayal. Some historians have suggested that Vlad may have had what we would now call antisocial personality disorder. People with this condition show a persistent pattern of disregard for others' rights, a lack of empathy, a willingness to use manipulation and violence to achieve their goals. The diagnosis is tempting. It would explain so much about Vlad's behaviour. But we should be cautious about applying modern psychiatric categories to historical figures. We cannot interview Vlad. We cannot administer psychological tests. We can only infer from his actions, and actions can be interpreted in many ways. What seems clear is that Vlad had an unusual capacity for violence. Most people, even in violent times, have limits. They can kill when necessary, but they feel something. Guilt, horror, reluctance. Vlad showed no such limits. He killed on a scale that shocked even his contemporaries, and he showed no sign of remorse. Was this because he was incapable of empathy, or because he had learned to suppress it, or because he had convinced himself that his victims deserved their fate? We cannot know for certain, but the last possibility is worth considering. Vlad may have believed that he was just. He may have seen himself not as a monster, but as a righteous ruler, punishing the wicked and protecting the innocent. This is how most perpetrators of atrocities see themselves. They do not think they are doing evil. They think they are doing good. They have constructed a moral framework in which their actions are justified, even necessary. Vlad's moral framework was shaped by his experiences. He had seen his family destroyed by treachery. He had learned that mercy was weakness. He had concluded that only absolute terror could maintain order in a chaotic world. Within this framework, impalement was not cruelty, it was justice. The boyars who died at the Easter massacre were traitors who had killed his father. The criminals who were executed had broken the law. The Ottoman prisoners had invaded his country. They all deserved what they got. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Vlad's psychology. He was not a mindless killer. He was a thinking, reasoning human being who had constructed a coherent worldview in which mass murder was morally acceptable, and he was not entirely wrong about the world he lived in. 15th century Wallachia was genuinely dangerous. Betrayal was common, violence was normal, a ruler who showed weakness would be destroyed. Vlad's methods were extreme, but they were not irrational given his circumstances. This does not excuse him. Nothing excuses the suffering he caused, but it does help us understand him. Vlad was not a demon or a madman. He was a human being responding to an inhuman situation with inhuman methods. The question this raises is uncomfortable. If Vlad's behaviour can be explained by his experiences and his environment, what does that say about human nature? Are we all capable of becoming Vlad, given the right circumstances? The evidence suggests that we might be. Studies of atrocities throughout history show that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when placed in certain situations. The guards at concentration camps, the participants in genocides, the torturers in authoritarian regimes. Most of them were not monsters. They were normal people who had been shaped by their circumstances to do monstrous things. Vlad's story is a warning. It shows us what can happen when trauma, power, and a certain kind of logic combine. It shows us the darkness that exists within human nature, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Understanding this does not mean accepting it. We can recognize the forces that shaped Vlad while still condemning what he did. We can see him as human while still holding him accountable for his choices. But we should not pretend that he was fundamentally different from us. That would be too easy. That would let us off the hook. The truth is harder. Vlad was human, and his humanity is what makes his story so terrifying. Vlad's death did not bring peace to Wallachia. The patterns he had lived through, the constant succession struggles, the foreign interference, the violence and instability, continued long after he was gone. His immediate successors faced the same impossible situation he had faced, caught between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary, forced to balance competing demands, never secure on their thrones. The lesson of Vlad's reign was clear. Defiance brought destruction. Most of his successors chose submission. Wallachia remained an Ottoman vassal state for centuries. The tribute was paid. The troops were provided. The voivodes came and went, installed and removed according to Ottoman interests. Independence was a memory, a dream, something that had been tried once and had failed. Vlad's family did not fare well. His sons, he had at least 2, possibly 3, inherited his enemies, along with his name. They faced the same dangers he had faced, the same treacherous politics, the same violent ends. His eldest son, Mehmed, eventually became voivode himself. He ruled briefly in the early 16th century and earned the nickname Mehmed Chelro, Mehmed the Bad. Like his father, he was known for cruelty. Like his father, he was eventually driven from power. Unlike his father, he was assassinated while in exile, stabbed to death on the steps of a church in Sibiu. The cycle continued. Vlad's descendants appeared periodically in Wallachian politics over the following generations, sometimes seizing the throne, sometimes dying in the attempt. The Draculesht line persisted. but it never achieved lasting power. The family that had produced the Impaler gradually faded into obscurity. Wallachia itself remained a battleground. The Ottomans and Hungarians continued to fight over it. Other powers, Poland, Austria, Russia, became involved as the centuries passed. The principality was a prize, a buffer zone, a corridor for armies marching in both directions. The boyar class that Vlad had tried to destroy eventually reasserted itself. New noble families rose to replace the ones he had eliminated. The old patterns of power, the factionalism, the betrayals, the constant manoeuvring returned. Vlad's attempt to create a centralized state based on terror had failed. The system he had fought against proved more durable than his reforms, but something had changed. Vlad's reign had demonstrated that resistance was possible. He had shown that a small principality could defy the Ottoman Empire, could inflict real damage, could make the Sultan himself turn back. The victory was temporary, the cost was enormous, but the example remained. This example would be remembered. In the centuries that followed, as Romanians struggled against foreign domination, Vlad became a symbol of what was possible. He had fought, he had resisted, he had refused to submit. Even in defeat, he had preserved something, a sense of dignity, of defiance, of national pride. The memory of Vlad helped sustain Romanian identity through centuries of foreign rule. When nationalists in the 19th century began to imagine an independent Romania, they looked back to figures like Vlad for inspiration. He became part of the national mythology, a founding hero of a nation that did not yet exist. This was Vlad's most lasting legacy. Not the terror, not the impalements, but the idea that Romanians could stand up to overwhelming power. The methods were forgotten or forgiven. The spirit of resistance was remembered and celebrated. Of course, this interpretation required selective memory. The Vlad who became a national hero was not quite the same as the Vlad who had actually lived. The mass executions were downplayed. The domestic terror was minimized. The focus was on his wars against the Ottomans, his defiance of foreign power, his willingness to sacrifice everything for his country. This is how national heroes are made. The inconvenient details are smoothed away. The complex, contradictory human being is transformed into a symbol, a story, a source of inspiration. The real person disappears behind the legend. Vlad would probably not have minded. He'd always been concerned with his image, with the messages he sent, with how he was perceived. He had used terror deliberately, knowing that his reputation would spread, that stories of his cruelty would reach his enemies and make them afraid. He had wanted to be remembered. He had wanted to be feared. In that sense, he succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. 5 centuries later, his name still evokes a shudder. He is still the Impaler, still Dracula, still a figure of darkness and dread, but he is also a national hero, a symbol of resistance, a source of pride. He is remembered differently by different people, interpreted and reinterpreted according to the needs of each generation. The world he left behind eventually became Romania, a unified nation, independent and sovereign, no longer caught between empires. The struggles he lived through, the impossible choices he faced, are now history. The country he fought for exists, even if it took 4 centuries to achieve. Would Vlad have been proud? Would he have seen modern Romania as the fulfillment of everything he fought for? Or would he have been disappointed, confused, unable to recognize the world his descendants created? We cannot know. The dead do not speak. They leave only traces, documents, artifacts, stories that the living interpret as they will. Vlad left more traces than most. His story has been told and retold, analysed and debated, celebrated and condemned. He has become one of history's most famous figures, known around the world, immortalised in literature and film. But the man himself remains elusive. Behind all the legends, behind all the interpretations, there was a human being, someone who was born, who lived, who suffered, who caused suffering, who died. That person is largely lost to us. We can only glimpse him through the distorting lens of history. Perhaps that is fitting. Vlad was always a master of appearances, of messages, of the stories people told about him. He controlled his image as carefully as he controlled his kingdom. Even now, 5 centuries later, he is still controlling it, still shaping how we see him, still refusing to be pinned down. The Impaler remains impaled on history, but he is not quite dead. He never will be. The name Dracula means 2 things today. To historians, it refers to Vlad III, the 15th century Prince of Wallachia. To everyone else, it refers to a vampire, a fictional creature created by Bram Stoker in 1897. These 2 Draculas have almost nothing in common, but they have become so entangled in popular imagination that separating them requires deliberate effort. Let us be clear about what Stoker knew and did not know. Stoker was an Irish writer and theatre manager. He spent years researching his vampire novel, reading about Transylvania, studying folklore, developing his plot. But his research was superficial by scholarly standards. He never visited Romania. He relied on travel books, encyclopedias, and his own imagination. He found the name Dracula in a book by William Wilkinson, a British consul who had written about the Romanian principalities. Wilkinson mentioned a voivode Dracula who had fought the Turks and whose name meant devil. Stoker liked the name. He used it. That was essentially the extent of the connection. Stoker did not know about the impalements. He did not know about the forest of stakes. He did not know about the war with Mehmed II, or the Easter massacre, or any of the other events that defined Vlad's reign. His Dracula was a Transylvanian count, not a Wallachian prince. His Dracula lived in a castle in the Carpathian Mountains, not in Targovište or Poenari. His Dracula was a supernatural creature who drank blood, transformed into a bat, and could not bear sunlight or garlic. None of this had anything to do with the historical Vlad. Stoker's vampire was drawn from folklore, Eastern European legends about the undead, about creatures that rose from their graves to feed on the living. These legends existed independently of Vlad. They were not inspired by him. The connection between Vlad and vampires is essentially a coincidence. Stoker borrowed a name. That name happened to belong to a historical figure. Over time, people assumed there must be a deeper connection. There was not. But the assumption has proven remarkably persistent. Once people learned that there was a real Dracula, they naturally wanted to know more. They discovered that the real Dracula was a brutal ruler who killed thousands of people. They connected the dots: blood, death, horror. The vampire must have been inspired by the Impaler. This connection has been reinforced by countless books, films, and documentaries. The real story behind Dracula has become a genre of its own. Writers and filmmakers have explored the supposed links between Vlad and Stoker's creation, often inventing connections where none existed. Some have suggested that Vlad drank the blood of his victims. There is no historical evidence for this. The claim appears to be a back formation, an attempt to make the historical figure fit the fictional vampire. Others have suggested that Vlad's cruelty inspired the vampire legend. This is also unsupported. Vampire folklore existed in Eastern Europe long before Vlad was born. The legends were not about him. The truth is simpler and less dramatic. Stoker needed a name. He found one. The name happened to belong to someone interesting. The rest is coincidence and imagination. But the fictional Dracula has had an enormous impact on how the historical Vlad is perceived. For most people around the world, Dracula means vampire. When they hear that there was a real Dracula, they expect something supernatural, something gothic, something connected to the horror genre. This creates problems for anyone trying to understand the historical figure. The vampire associations get in the way. They create expectations that the real story cannot fulfill. Vlad was not a supernatural creature. He was a human being, more interesting than any vampire, but also more complicated and harder to understand. The vampire myth has also affected how Vlad is marketed. In Romania, the Dracula brand is enormously valuable. Tourists come from around the world hoping to see Dracula's castle, to visit the places associated with the vampire legend. This has led to some creative geography. Bran Castle, the site most commonly marketed as Dracula's castle, has only a tenuous connection to Vlad. He may have passed through it once. He certainly never lived there. The castle's Gothic appearance and mountain setting make it look like a vampire's lair, which is why it became associated with Dracula. Historical accuracy was not the point. The real sites associated with Vlad, Targovište, Poenari, Snagov, are less visited and less developed. They do not fit the vampire aesthetic. They are ruins, monasteries, places that require historical knowledge to appreciate. They cannot compete with the Gothic fantasy of Bran Castle. This is frustrating for historians and for Romanians who want their history taken seriously. The vampire myth has overshadowed the real story. The complex, fascinating, horrifying truth has been replaced by a cartoon. But perhaps there is something to be learned from the persistence of the vampire connection. Why has it proven so durable? Why do people want to believe that Vlad inspired Dracula? Part of the answer is that the connection feels right, even if it is not historically accurate. Vlad and the vampire share something essential. They are both figures of terror, both associated with blood and death, both symbols of the darkness that lurks in human nature. The vampire is a metaphor. It represents fears that are difficult to articulate directly. Fear of death, fear of the powerful, fear of the foreign, fear of the predatory. These fears are universal. They exist in every culture, in every era. Vlad tapped into the same fears. His methods were designed to terrify. The forests of impaled bodies, the mass executions, the systematic cruelty, all of it was meant to inspire dread. He wanted to be a monster. He wanted people to fear him more than they feared death itself. In this sense, Vlad and the vampire are kindred spirits. They both embody the terror of absolute power, of violence without limit, of evil that cannot be reasoned with or escaped. The fictional vampire is a supernatural expression of fears that Vlad made real. Perhaps this is why the connection persists. People sense that Vlad and Dracula belong together, even if the historical link is weak. They are both expressions of the same darkness, the same dread, the same nightmare. The vampire will never die. That is part of the myth, the undead creature that rises again and again, that cannot be permanently destroyed. In the same way, Vlad will never be forgotten. His story will be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, as long as people are fascinated by power and terror and the extremes of human behaviour.